Good morning. Today is Tuesday, November 26, 2019. It is 9:30 and it is the regularly scheduled meeting of the Los Angeles Board of Police Commissioners. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Good morning. Let the record reflect that Commissioners Decker, Figueroa, Zovrov are present, and we have a quorum.
Thank you very much.
Madam President, the department has requested item 1H be pulled from the agenda.
Thank you.
It'll come back at a future date with corrections.
Thank you very much. We have on today's agenda then 4 items that can generally be categorized: donations, 2 items regarding the chief's travel, 1 contract and audit, and the proposed budget to be sent to the mayor. Let me just take the donation items. Commissioners, do you have any questions on items A through D?
No.
Seeing no questions,
I do.
on A through D?
Donation. Yes.
Which one? I'll hold that matter.
Yeah, it's applies to all of them, but the donation.
Could you turn your mic on, sir? I'm sorry. There you go.
Yeah, so I had a question, and it came to mind primarily in connection with the lockers, but it's really across the board. The paperwork routinely indicates, that the donations are not solicited, and the question just is, how does the need the need come to the donor's attention if the donation is not solicited?
And excuse me, for the record, please, Commissioner Bonner is now present.
Thank you. Sir.
Good morning, Mike Kunis, the Assistant Director of Operations. Good morning, Commissioners.
Morning.
So what was the question again, Commissioner?
The question was that the paperwork that accompanies the donations, routinely indicates that the donations are not solicited. And the question really is, how does the need come to the donor's attention if there's not some form of solicitation?
So the 77th Street Foundation is a charitable foundation that works with all the police divisions in the city, and they're looking for improvements that can't be accommodated by the city itself. So for instance, Newton Division needed lockers amongst a bunch of other items. So what happens is that there is the command works with the charitable foundation, and in the course of discussions, there's a need. There's an ask of the foundation, like how can they help? And so in this case, the lockers has been something that the division has needed for the past probably 7 years, and so in general discussions is how that comes up, and then they decide whether or not that's something that they want to offer to help the organization purchase.
So I take it so you're saying generally throughout the years, ongoing with this group and potentially with some other donors, there's ongoing discussion, collaboration where the donor is familiar with the activity and operations in this case like 77th Street, and then in the course of those discussions, these various needs are identified.
So there's various needs across. In this case, it's lockers, but in the course of other donations that have come before the commission, this foundation is always looking to help improve the facilities, the equipment, the things that the officers use in the field daily. And so that's how the lockers came up in this situation. Is that there was a need for the past few years where there needs to be storage and things, and the city is just not going to accommodate storage for large bags full of equipment. So this foundation then decides whether or not that's something that they want to help assist to create a good work environment, to build morale, etc. That's what that foundation is mainly about, is building officer morale, assisting in areas that the city just doesn't have the funds to assist with when it comes to station improvements.
Yeah, fair enough. So one suggestion or question I just made, I know we're expecting a report or an analysis of some kind at some point relative to
From the
broad
Inspector
topic
General's
of
office, they're doing
donations,
a
right?
review.
And that's one thing that I want to just make sure that we look at. I know that we've had questions along those lines before, but just to make sure we understand what that really means in terms of those situations where a need is known and someone offers support to address a need versus those cases where the department is bringing a need to the attention of a potential donor. Because in the latter case, that does strike me as some form of solicitation of the donation. And that's not to say necessarily it's problematic, and it's not to say that that's what occurred here. I'm just pointing out that you see that whenever you have that boilerplate language, that just repeats in a document over and over again. Sometimes there can be a disconnect between what the paper actually says and how things actually happen. So I want to make sure that we understand those cases in which someone does bring a need to a donor's attention versus those where the donor is just otherwise aware of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Were there other questions?
No.
Or, other commissioners?
No questions on
No
A,
questions?
A, B, C, or D.
A through D. Okay, very well. Madam Secretary, I'd like to take public comment on items A through D. Let's start with A, please.
Okay, we have one on A. Mr. Herman?
And how many do we have on B?
Each item, we have one.
And are they all Mr. Herman?
No, for B, we have Jeffrey Dilshad.
And item C?
Mr. Herman?
And item D?
Mr. Herman.
Very well. Mr. Herman, you're going to take A, C, and D in that order.
Wait, I'm getting
Sir,
here. Yes.
item A, please.
I heard you. Can you hear me now? For the record, on this item 1A 09-50529, shoot the nig. The department's report dated November 19, 2019 for the meals at a value of $600. That's not enough money when you got hungry police officers who don't make enough money doing this hard job. So relative to the various donations valued also for the training, who the fuck pays $3,850 for the detrimental effects of bad policing for adverse bribery and money laundering when it comes to these division benefits of various donations? Well, there's also a $4,000 wellness, and I still don't have insurance after 8 fucking months. But that's not my problem. Thank you, Mr. Bob Green, Deputy Chief. So the board's action, as recommended, was to accept the donations, but I oppose because digital media equipment at $10,000 exceeds my wellness. All I want is good insurance like Kaiser that provides a wellness center for people with disabilities, and you have access to free medical without these stipulants where you have to pay a fucking deductible. So police have the same problem too when they report a workers' comp issue, and they should have those fucking fees waived so that they too, like me, can get wellness and get the fuck out of the city of LA.
Sir, you now are on item 1C.
You're going out of order, ma'am.
Yes, I am. 1C, please.
So now that I'm on item C for cunt, Miss Dana Katz, meow.
Sir, you're off topic. You
That's the
either
name.
addressed
That's the name
item
of the
C.
lady on the report on C.
Item C, you can address the
The
substance of item C,
150th
sir.
value. 150th anniversary celebration. I'm on topic. I was reading that book back there regarding this $20,000 because I wrote a 20 right there. Value 20. Ni me importa, puta. So, again, from the Los Angeles Police Foundation for the benefit of the Los Angeles Department as set forth under BPC number 19. Oh, let me reframe that. For the record to reflect my opinion on BPC number 19-03109. It almost sounds like that United States versus Bagdasarian, but it's not. To receive the department's report for transmit. I just got my transcripts, as a matter of fact, from the Stanley Moss courts, but that's off topic. So to tell the mayor, the Los Angeles mayor who created this homeless crisis.
Sir, you're not on topic. This is
I'm on C, Miss.
related to the 150th
Yes.
anniversary.
Yes.
You haven't said anything regarding
Ma'am,
that donation.
there's 3 parts to it. Department's report, recommendations with an S, and it says to receive. I'm trying to finish right where it says receive. Just because I have a disability, you don't discriminate because my mind doesn't work like yours. Really, that's discrimination. Under the color of the law, you should respect my
Sir,
rights.
you need to address the
I
item,
am.
sir.
18 U.S.C. 245, have respect for my public comment. This is a part of a service rendered under the federal law, not your fucking bullshit.
Sir, now you're on item D.
D for Dick, Herman. Yeah, locker cabinets. There's a lot of storage that police officers carry around. They shouldn't have to carry that heavy luggage because, you know, storage is a very important necessity, especially for homeless people who live in a crisis where there's not enough locker space or cabinet space, along with those large bags they lug around the city. And our officers do a tremendous great job, those rank and files. I love those motherfuckers for that $40,000 donations for the LAPD motherfuckers at the 77th Charitable Foundation Incorporation. Next time, give these motherfuckers $80,000 so we make sure that every officer or rank and file has enough storage large enough for their bags, because officers carry multiple weapons and toys like Batman does. And the paperwork is very, very needed, as Mr. Dale Bonner pointed out, and I'll quote him, "Paperwork? How the need?" Well, he's right. So my recommendation for the board, excuse me, I got something in my mouth. It was that piece of shit I ate this morning. Well, my recommendation for the board is to tell that fucking faggot Eric Garcetti, the mayor, and the city council to approve and accept this under the value of the $40,000, and know for a fact that the Bain Act 52.1 and the Brown Act allows me, the legislative body, to make this point appropriate and stand. So I'm here to approve this motion, but in the future, when you're taking bribes and money laundering for this adverse detrimental effects to the public's interest, I remind you, the FBI needs to investigate this shit, bitch.
Thank you. On item 1D, Jeffrey.
1B, this is the Scientology $20,000 donation. Okay, I guess there'll be no dialogue, but I'll just provide the commentary of my opinion. I think this is a conflict of interest. Yes. I was actually dealing with LAPD a while ago regarding annoying text messages. This is going to me, this is hypocrisy. It's a little bit hypocritical, more than a little bit maybe. I remember dealing with some LAPD people in the Central Station, and we were discussing annoying text messages, which I was under investigation for, which apparently prevented me from doing anything or going anywhere because I was a suspect in a serious spam emailing crime. But Scientology is, people complain about them in relation to things like human trafficking and other things, which I would consider more substantial than annoying text messages. So I don't know how, if they're giving you $20,000 that we know about and you're accepting that, you're able to investigate them if people are accusing them of holding them against their will or things like that, which it seems like people are, from what I've heard. Toy giveaways, cadets, yeah. I guess that about covers it. I would say that this is a bad idea, and you shouldn't sell your services to the highest bidder.
Thank you, sir. With respect to item A, is there a motion to approve the report and accept the donation? Is there a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Passes. With respect to item B, the recommendation.
Madam President, we do have one more comment card on B.
Okay, that would be late. Can you add it to the general public comment, please?
Okay.
Is there a motion to receive the report and transmit to the mayor and city council for
So moved.
acceptance? Is there a second? Second. All in favor? Aye. All opposed? It passes 4-0. With respect to C, is there a motion to receive the department's report and transmit to the mayor and city council for acceptance?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. It passes 4-0. And with respect to D, is there a motion to approve the department's report and transmit to the mayor and city council?
So moved.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
It passes 4-0. The next two matters on the agenda are E and F. I propose taking them together. They are both related to the chief's travel in general. Item E for travel on a tour for the Seattle Development Center. And Chief, I would just ask you generally what that is about and the benefit of that. And then the second item is to reimburse the chief for travel previously approved. So, Chief, with respect to item E.
Good morning, Commissioners. And with respect to item E, which is proposed travel for me to go to Seattle, Washington, and meet with Axiom in their Seattle Development Center. Axiom is, as you know, the contractor that provides for our body-worn videos as well as our body-worn, the taser devices, the electronic control devices. And in my previous conversation, while in IACP in Chicago, meeting with Mr. Smith, he invited us to see their strategic direction for the next 4 to 5 years as they continue to integrate their various systems in regards to policing needs. So this is an opportunity for us with an individual or an organization that we're invested heavily in as far as the utilization of their tools to understand where their strategies and migrations are for potential fit and also opportunities as well as contrast with other manufacturers and people who provide such equipment.
And I assume as well an opportunity for you to provide input as to the needs of the department that hopefully they incorporate into their planning.
Absolutely. Their cameras and their electronic control devices continues to benefit from their close relationship with us and understanding what the needs are. For instance, their next model that is coming out in the Axiom 3, which will be the third iteration of body-worn video, has an auto activation feature that is tied into an officer's holster. That is a direct concern to this commission as well as myself and the public's trust, is that when officers are engaging in spontaneous and sudden instances, they currently are required to manually activate their device. And while we take safeguards for muscle memory and also provide for a 2-minute buffer for as they're trying to catch up with situations, an auto activation feature is something that we've been working with them and other manufacturers to incorporate into their system, into the product design.
Thank you, Chief. With respect to item F, Chief, if you could just give us a summary of the benefits of having attended that planning workshop.
Yes, so the Los Angeles County Police Officers Association is a group of chief officers from the 42 cities in LA County that make up the various independent cities, Long Beach, Glendale, Pasadena, etc. And each year we have our strategic planning workshop that goes to emerging trends and patterns, for instance, our radio communications systems and how those system requirements are changing here in the next 2 years with the losing of certain transmission bands and the adoption of a interoperability, as well as pending and approaching events such as the Super Bowl and the 2020 Olympics. How, as a region, are we addressing those challenges? What are collective needs, individual challenges by individual chiefs? It's an opportunity for us to share our successes as well as identify programs and initiatives in various other departments that the department may take advantage of.
Thank you, Chief. Are there other questions for the Chief on items E or F?
No.
Madam Secretary, are there public comment cards on E and F?
E, we have none, and on F, we have Mr. Herman.
I'll move E.
Mr. Herman, please step forward with respect to item E. Is there a motion to approve the department's report?
So moved.
Second? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. It passes. Mr. Herman on item F, then.
Some problems going on with my health. I don't have insurance. So 1F. BPC number 19-0310 for the record regarding Temecula, California, down in that south side of town where I love the winery. Yeah, I'm in support of Michael Moore's expenses, but this amount is fucking ridiculous. No one can spend that little money. When the times are hard, you need to double this fucking shit. This fucking money is not enough for Mr. Moore and his girlfriend to fuck around in Temecula. for that $467.64 like Chief Charlie Beck used to do. Fuck with his girlfriend.
Sir, you need to address the
Yeah,
reimbursement
well,
for this
attending the
particular expense.
2019 Los Angeles County Police Chiefs Association called LACPCA. That's an acronym. I don't know what it means, but I'm going to take a guess that it stands for Los Angeles County.
Sir, you're not addressing the substance of the action the board has to
I'm
take.
making reference to the acronym that you have here, ma'am. I'm on topic.
That is just repetition, sir. You need
No,
to
it's
address
not.
the substance.
People are not educated about what an acronym looks like, and I'm reading it into the record. Please don't interrupt me in the Brown Act violation that you continue to do. So, Mr. Michael Moore, enjoy your $467.64 and spend that motherfucker wisely. You got my support.
Is there a motion to approve the department's report?
So moved.
Second? All in favor? Aye. It passes. Opposed? It passes 4-0. Thank you. With respect to item G, Captain Casey, are you here to talk about that item? If you could come forward, or whoever is here, to briefly address what this matter is and the request of the Police Commission.
Absolutely, and good morning. And I have with me Sergeant Kennedy and Lieutenant Kwan. Sergeant Kennedy is the OIC of Oak Tree Shooting Range, and Lieutenant Kwan is the OIC of our firing range. Oak Tree, we've been leasing since 2009. We have 1,322 rifle cadres out in the field, and Oak Tree is responsible for training and keeping them qualified, and that is the only facility that is able to do that with the police patrol rifle. We train in police patrol rifle and slug ammunition at Oak Tree, and we've been, like I said, since 2009, and Oak Tree has been a good partner with the city of LA, where they haven't raised their lease price on us since 2009 when we signed our first lease with them.
My question. Good.
And does the facility satisfy your needs for training purposes?
Absolutely.
Are there questions from the commission?
No.
No? Is there public comment on item G?
No, there is not.
In that case, it's late, sir. The item has already been called. Is there a motion to approve the department's report
So
and
moved.
transmit to the mayor? Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. It passes 4-0. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
The next item, H, as stated earlier, has been taken off calendar today. We're moving on to item I, the audit of the gang enforcement detail extension. Good morning, and if you could introduce yourselves for the record, please. Too.
Yes, good morning. Jeffrey Phillips, Commanding Officer, Audit Division.
Bob Arcos, the Director of the Office of Operations.
Martin Kunis, Assistant Director of Operations.
Good morning, all.
Morning.
Commissioners, before you, you have the Gang Enforcement Detail Extension Audit. Although Audit Division has conducted audits that included the testing of Gang Enforcement Detail extensions, this is the first audit tested exclusively for this extension process. Now, for this audit, Audit Division looked at the Gang Enforcement Detail officers who were deployed as of deployment period number 13, 2018. It was determined there were 4 supervisors and 47 officers whose tours of duty were over the 39 deployment periods as of deployment period number 13. All 51 gang enforcement detail personnel identified were assessed under objectives number 1 and 2A. Objectives number 2B and 3 had a differing amount of personnel assessed based on the application of those particular audit objectives. There were 3 overarching audit objectives with 4 tests that were completed. Objective number 1 tested for the completeness of the gang enforcement detail extension request package, for which 96% met the standard. Objective number 2A tested the timely approval of the extension request packages, for which 75% of the packages met the standard. Perhaps the best manner in which to describe some of the shortfalls that we observed herein is there appears to be a lack of a mechanism to begin the review process of officers whose extensions are going to be requested or whose tour of duty are coming up. The policy does indicate that area commanding officers must anticipate the culmination and limited tours, and that is essentially saying that area COs need to be cognizant of officers' tour of duty within GED, whose time will be coming up soon, whether it is to begin advertising for a position within the gang enforcement detail and to make a selection, or to request an extension of those particular officers. However, there's nothing mandated that the extension request begins at a certain time or anything like that. Now, I'm not implying that it should be part of the policy, but certainly just some thought in setting up a system that would identify those officers and begin that process of the extension request. And we did make some recommendations to this effect for Office of Operations to look into, and my understanding is that they have done that. With objective number 2B, which is related to objective 2A, and that it looked at the gang enforcement detail personnel deployment, and for which whose tour of duty extension had not been approved at that time. Policy requires that if a gang enforcement detail officer's tour of duty had expired, they shall not work in a GED assignment. And herein we identified 13 GED personnel who had expired tours of duty, 10 for which had not been deployed out in the field or worked in a GED assignment. There were 3 officers, however, that had been deployed to the field. And finally, objective number 3 looked at sustained complaints for officers whose extensions were requested and which had sustained complaints for specific allegations, and wherein a justification was included for maintaining the officers within the gang enforcement detail. We identified just 1 officer that had one of these types of sustained complaints, and it was there was a justification for including in the extension package. And that concludes my summary.
Very good. Before we get to you, Chief, if you don't mind, can you offer a little bit of history of this? I read in the report it's a legacy of the consent decree, and these audits have been continued periodically. Can you just give a little history of why this is important, what the significance is of this, and the 39 deployment period? Where did that come from specifically, if you know?
Yes, ma'am. Essentially, the identification of how officers are working gang assignments back then, going back to Crash, the Rampart Board of Inquiry identified that the manner in which officers were being identified to be assigned to the Crash unit was, or there wasn't anything that was in place that was formalized. Essentially, it was on recommendations of gang officers themselves, and they would make a recommendation to their supervisor, and they would go ahead and have that officer transfer in. And we know what happened with the whole Rampart scandal, and as part of the consent decree, it was formalized to go ahead and have a mechanism in place where the gang assignment was a tour of duty, and it's limited, and if there's any extensions for an officer to remain any longer, then there's a process wherein the Bureau commanding officer can approve it if it's an extension up to 3 deployment periods. But if it's an extension up to 13 deployment periods, this has to go all the way to Chief of Police. And that essentially formalized the importance of this assignment, wherein such an extension has to be approved by the Chief of Police.
Thank you. And I wanted to get that history into the record because we do view this audit, in fact, all the audits that you do, as critically important. But I wanted to be sure to put it in the context before we asked any additional questions.
Yes,
Chief Arcos, did you want to respond, sir? Thank you.
Yes, good morning, Commissioners, and thank you again for laying that foundation. That's a really critically important history of our department. Also, I think it's important for the commissioners to recognize that joining me here today is a representative from each of the geographic bureaus. I have Deputy Chief Regina Scott from Operations South Bureau here today, Deputy Chief Justin Eisenberg from Operations West Bureau, the Assistant Commanding Officer from Operations Valley Bureau, Commander Alan Hamilton, and the Assistant Commanding Officer from Operations Central Bureau, Commander Mark Reyna. And that was at the direction of the Office of Operation that they be here today to underscore and stress the importance of this critical sensitive area that we're discussing with you today. Quite frankly, Commissioner, I think you've heard us talk about the management of risk in our organization, and specifically when we're addressing traffic collisions, we have two classifications. We say preventable or non-preventable. In this audit that's delivered here before you today, this audit was preventable. We have systems and controls in place that could have prevented the missed opportunities on these extension delays. One of the things that I do recognize and identify is that we've had a number of turnover in the bureaus with our bureau chiefs, bureau commanders, and our bureau gang coordinators and gang impact teams in some areas. But that is no excuse. We have really very well-designed systems and controls that this should have been prevented. Commander Ramkunis is going to talk a little bit about our recommendations and actions taken since we were made aware of this audit, and then I'll speak at the end, or I'll address any other questions you might have from the Office of Operations. Okay.
Thank you. And excuse me, whoever has a phone on that's making that noise, if you could kindly turn it off. Thank you. Sir?
Yes, ma'am. So in response to the audit, I do have to say that the measures in place, were effective in this. There was an audit.
To be clear, ineffective.
Well, if you look at item 2B, in this sense, there was 10 officers where the extension packages were not completed in a timely manner, and the commands did remove those officers from the field as is required. There were 3 that weren't, who worked a few days, and there was one anomaly, that was well past the 200-day mark. But looking at that, on November 20th, the office sent out a reminder to the bureau chiefs and to the commanders and to the bureau gang coordinators and the bureau and the area gang lieutenants about extension procedures, along with checklists and the reminders and all the protocols in place. So that was step 1. In 2001. In June of 2001, when the consent decree became law, there was a database, a GED tour database that was implemented, and that was back in 2001. So after a review, we determined that the database that's in effect to track officers' time in gang units, their start date, their end date, the training received through the course of the various tours, was not being used effectively. So what we did is we went back to the bureau chiefs, to the commanders, and to the same people identified, and evaluated the use of that, and then re-implemented and re-taught the folks about that database. So there is a database that's in effect to track, to help capture. On top of that, what we're looking at from the office side is the database can send email reminders and notifications. So what we believe can be helpful, we believe it's the officer's responsibility. Every officer who comes into a gang unit knows they have 39 DPs, but to ensure that the sergeants, lieutenants, and the bureaus are staying on top of the 39 DPs prior to the extension request that needs to go to the chief of police, we can implement an email reminder about 60 days out prior to the completion of the 39 DPs, which will be an extra layer for a reminder to the officers and to the bureau gang lieutenant. We've instructed all the bureau gang lieutenants that it's their job, that is one of their responsibilities, is to monitor the gang database. When officers are selected for gangs, it runs up through the bureau for selection, and one of their jobs and duties is to stay on top of that and to ensure that we don't have the problem that's been identified in the audit. And then the last thing, which I believe, working with Chief Arcos, we're looking at an extra layer of review. At this time, the Office of Operations does not see the gang extension requests when they come through. It comes through the Bureau, then to the Office of Constitutional Policing. So what we're going to recommend is an extra layer so the office can see the folks that are being requested for extension, so we can have input and say on that, and recommendations to the Office of Constitutional Policing and then to the office and to the Chief of Police, to ensure that the extensions are being handled correctly. So those extra layers, the extra training back into the database, we're confident that we won't be in this position again.
Commissioner, just one quick comment on that. This is essentially a bottom-up responsibility as well. We believe that the officers have a responsibility as well as the supervisors to recognizing their extension due out date. Los Angeles police officers all know their date that they started the academy, their class date, and they know the date they retired. So this is also another thing that we were going to start memorializing with officers as part of the assimilation and suitability interviews that are conducted with the officers once that they are selected. That is memorialized, that they know their exact date that they're sunsetting out and they're going to be they're required for extension. So they have a responsibility also to remind their supervision. This is not minimizing the importance of the oversight at every other layer, but we also want to put that down with every officer's responsibility and supervisor's responsibility of recognizing their due date out.
I appreciate you saying that because as I read the report, as I read it, it was the supervisor's responsibility. And one of my questions is, why isn't this everyone's responsibility equally? And what also struck me from reading the audit was that this problem not only is preventable, but it should be easily solvable through automation technology, much of what you've spoken about. And while I appreciate the department's proactive efforts to correct and get on top of this problem and be reflective of it, unless my fellow commissioners object, I'd like a report back in 6 months to have frankly, a report on the progress that's been made in implementing all of the recommendations also made by Audit Division, but also what you have highlighted today, and to determine whether the problem is on the pathway to being completely corrected or whether we continue to have a problem that has to be further addressed. But I don't want to impede the ability of my colleagues to speak and address any aspect of the audit that they may have. Colleagues, are there questions from anyone?
No, I don't.
Commissioner Bonner, do you have any?
Yeah, it's just some clarification. And I appreciate the suggestion and as well on the report back. One of the recommendations was to develop a notification and tracking system to address some of the issues, and it wasn't clear to me from the reference to the management's response is relatively general in nature. So I wanted to clarify, even from your comments, is this developing a new system? Is it tweaking an existing system? Is it not necessary? What is what's going to be happening there?
So it would be tweaking the system. We do have a database that if used correctly, tracks, monitors, and allows for the oversight that is needed for gang units. But we would be adding a email notification. So we would just be adding an additional notification measure to the database already.
Was wasn't clear, was the existing data system that was just referenced, was that looked at as part of was the adequacy of that system looked at as part of the audit?
As far as the how accurate it was with the gang enforcement detail officers, yes. That was actually reconciled with another list that the Office of Constitutional Policing has. So we did look for the accuracy. We did not look at whether it was in fact being used to identify officers whose tour of duty was coming up due. That didn't really come up for consideration until towards the end of the audit, where we saw some of these findings.
Yeah, Commissioner, if I could just add that the effective use of the database was clear to us with the Operations Central Bureau. And their sampling of the inspection, they had 100%. And they use that database regularly and consistently. So to us, that really satisfied our questions. I mean, you pose a really good question. Does the system itself need to be updated or, again, reworked or re-engineered to satisfy the needs for the extensions? But the use of it out of Operation Central Bureau was a very good reminder that when it is done correctly, that it could be the preventable issues were corrected.
So the net result of all, there's going to be some adjustments made to the system, both in terms of its functionality and its use, and some additional focus on let me rephrase. So there's going to be some technical adjustments to the system in terms of its functionality, and some additional adjustments to make sure that operationally it's going to be used for all that it's capable or will be capable of.
Yes, sir.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Excuse me, any other questions? No? Are there public comment cards on item 1I?
Yes, we have three. Mr. Herman, Hamid Khan, and Adam Smith.
Mr. Herman? Mr. Khan, if you're ready. I don't see you, sir. Are you here? Okay.
I brought my League of Nations card for you to observe. Isn't it beautiful? So what we're trying to explain to all of you is that Jeffrey Burt,
On these two acronyms under clear assignment and teams, we found on page 9 dishonesty, discrimination, sexual harassment, which never ends in Los Angeles like Jose Huizar jerking off with Francine Godoy, improper search and seizure, constantly a racial issue of minorities and blacks especially, which Mr. Bonner would know, and false arrests like Wayne Spindler and false charges that never happened.
You're not addressing the audit that's before us, sir.
I'm summarizing what I read on those 11 pages in the book back there, ma'am. So please
Sir,
do not interrupt me on this item I.
Item 1I.
I know. I just got through 10 on 1I. The department's report for November 22nd, gang enforcement that did not meet the standards. So just because I have a disability and I have the ability to address this consent decree issue and the scope of your mythology, the summary that indicates you need to improve is what the fuck I'm talking about. So I know I'm on topic. I know where I'm at in life. Hess versus Indiana. We'll take the fucking streets back again or later. Because I know where I'm at in my content. That's why I brought what you deserve. You see this symbol? It's an acronym. 42 U.S.C. 1983, fuck you.
Mr. Khan and then Mr. Smith.
I'm trying to figure out exactly what is being discussed over here, because the way it's being presented is that as if the gang enforcement detail is this very sort of sensationalist special operation. What it is, it's like, I mean, it's interesting. It's almost like a tour of duty, which falls into the very much the whole narrative of militarization of policing. But gang enforcement detail was central to Operation Laser, and we know the sheer failure and the corruption and the violence in that program. So, I mean, you know, so the idea for the extensions and the deployment of gang enforcement details, where, you know, part of the gang enforcement detail being that the commanders were, and this is Mark Smith's audit, were, you know, telling them to manufacture reasonable suspicion to make these stops. So gang enforcement detail, this whole bullshit idea and trying to sensationalize this garbage is like the questions are not being really asked. What about the Metro and gang enforcement detail involved in the disparate impact of young black and brown people in South Central Los Angeles? That report has been all over the place. So gang enforcement is not just like, you know, this very sexy, sensationalist, once in a while, let's show up. This is routine policing. The question is, where is this routine policing? And this is routine policing in where black and brown communities are. This is routine policing because it's very apropos that it'll be in Central Bureau because that's where all the unhoused communities are as well. So this is exactly what militarization of policing, when we talk about that, who's on the receiving end of this gang enforcement violence. So I think you guys need to really, when you ask about an audit, just go through the details, start nitpicking this stuff, and see what is the history of, you know, and these are documentations that we got from LAPD in our lawsuit, on a public records lawsuit, detailing exactly who was assigned to a gang enforcement detail. And when you go through the list of chronic offenders, you know, and the way they are listed, it's all GED, GED, GED. So this is routine policing and not just once in a while kind of tour of duty or something.
Thank you, Mr. Khan. Mr. Smith?
Good morning. I don't really have much to say beyond seconding everything that Hamid just said. But I do want to just lift up that, you know, the community continually calls the LAPD and has always called the LAPD like an occupying force in black and brown communities, a militarized force in black and brown communities, bringing violence to black and brown communities. And so I guess when I see up here integrity and all we say and do, the say thing kind of just jumped out at me this morning as you all referred to deployments and tours of duty. Because that's, you know, that's militarized language. And I'm not asking you to change your language. I'm just pointing it out to say that this is systemically what the LAPD is in black and brown communities. It's not about serving and protecting. It's about pulling down and criminalizing poverty and criminalizing the other. So, yeah, when $1 Million Hoods did their report last year of black folks getting pulled over 5 times their population share, that's gang enforcement. When your gang enforcement officers pulled over a car that Carnell Snell was in the back seat of because he looked over at the police car supposedly in a strange way while you were driving in a different direction, ended up chasing and killing him, that's gang enforcement.
Thank you, sir.
Madam.
The requested action is to approve the department's report, but I would request commissioners it be with the amendment to return in 6 months with a report back to the commission. Is there a motion to that effect?
So moved.
And it's second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? It passes 4-0. Thank you very much. We'll turn now to the proposed budget.
Madam President, we did receive a late card on one item, which will be moved to public comment for Yvonne Michelle Autry.
Thank you. Thank you. Before I open it up, please have a seat. Colleagues, I just want to, I believe, frame the issue. And Mr. Tiefenk, when I'm done, I'm going to, given your experience, ask if I have this correct. Fair warning. What we have before us is the proposed budget for next fiscal year. That would be the budget year 2021. And let me begin by thanking everyone in the Fiscal Operations Division who I know work on budget issues year-round, not just in preparing this budget, but then continue on working through the budget process across the street, and then inevitably over the course of any fiscal year based on the direction of council and the mayor and the CAO's office, budgets change, usually in a downward direction. It's an ongoing process. I recognize staff rarely gets the recognition, so I'd like to, on behalf of all the commissioners, thank all the staff members in Fiscal Operations Division for what they do. Prior to today, Commissioner Goldsmith and I, who are, as you know, members of the Executive Committee, sat down with members of the budget team to get a briefing and provided input. Obviously, all of us cannot discuss it collectively ahead of time because the appropriate place is here today. But the function of the Executive Committee is to get those briefings ahead of time. However, we did not speak for the full commission. We did provide input. And today, of course, is the time for everybody to provide their input. I know we all received last Friday a full budget binder that took some time to get through. I did get through it, so thank again to the team for all that detail. I know all city budgets are incredibly complex, but our role, at least based on my experience and from what took place last year, is that we are presenting a proposed budget to the mayor based largely on predetermined obligations that we have no input on, such as all the salaries that are predetermined, the size of the department, and other factors that are out of the hands of this commission. After what we decide today, the proposed budget is sent to the mayor's office. He collects and his team from all the departments, their respective budgets. He then sets priorities. They determine anticipated revenue, and based on experience, everything is cut from every single department. It then goes to council with extensive budget hearings. Each department presents. The CAO sets revenue projections, which, as I recall, change up until potentially the last minute. Council sets priorities, and again, usually substantial cuts are made to everyone's budget if history is any reflection of the future. But it is the elected officials who truly set policy for the budget. Our role, however, in reviewing the budget is not just to ask questions about what's already been predetermined, if there are questions, but where we, I think in my experience, have the most impact is the setting of the priorities if there are discretionary funds available. That's a big if, of course, if there are discretionary funds available. So while I welcome, and I'm sure the budget team welcomes questions on all issues, my recommendation for all of us today is to pay special attention to the list of priorities that the department has put together, ensure it's consistent with the priorities that this commission has talked about during the year, and make any specific changes. In my experience, that's where we have the most influence. Mr. Teefank, generally based on your experience, and Mr. Soboroff, I'll ask you as well, do I generally have that framework correct?
Yes, you do, Madam President. As you said, the budget will leave here and it's transmitted to the mayor, and then with mayor and the CAO, we'll combine and make some recommendations. Ultimately, it'll go to Public Safety Committee. I'm sorry, the Budget and Finance Committee, where it'll be vetted further, and then they'll make recommendations to the full council, who will then make a recommended budget to the mayor.
So this is really just the beginning of
Yes.
getting the budget process started.
Starts the process.
Mr. Soboroff, I know you've dealt with
I just
about
have a
8 of
question,
these.
President Decker. In the meeting that you had, I guess, with
The budget team here, and
with the
Commissioner
budget
Goldsmith.
and Commissioner Goldsmith, were there any priorities that you requested to be shifted, and could you go over those with us?
The answer to your question is yes. We did ask for a shifting of priorities, and now you're testing my memory on precisely which ones.
They probably remember.
They probably remember. I believe there were some equipment issues. It might have also been CSP moving up. Is that right? I'm trying to recall.
I believe the main one was moving up the implicit bias training, less lethal devices, and taser devices up to number 3.
Because we talked about that before, and I just want to
Yes.
make sure. That
Largely because that equipment is at its end of life date. Is that
Tasers
the right
are
term to
exactly
use?
approaching warranty expiration, yes.
Warranty expiration,
And
thank
then
you.
also just because of our focus on non-lethal devices. So there was that, and then also just some clarification on the video surveillance systems, that did include the adult and juvenile holding cells.
Right, and I know there were questions. I think the department in the draft already had the CSP Community Safety Partnership very high, and I know we asked some questions on that, but I think it was already a very high priority in the proposed draft.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I've stated probably too much, and I'd like to get to the substance of your presentation. So thank you very much for your patience, and colleagues, thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Commission President, for your kind words. Good morning, Commissioners. I am Anne Marie Sauer, the Department's Chief Financial Officer. With me today is Patricia Paterno, the officer in charge of our budget section. First, in echoing what Commission President Decker said, I really want to thank Patricia and her team. I continue to refer them as a very small but mighty budget team. We have about 4 people, in addition to Patricia, in that section right now. So for the countless hours, nights, weekends that that the team put in, a huge, huge thank you to them in terms of getting to this point and putting together the proposed budget that you have before you. I would also like to thank our various subject matter experts, many of whom are here today from ASB, personnel, and ITG. Again, we wouldn't be here without their partnership, so a huge thanks to them. The department's 2021 proposed budget has been developed based on the department's goals as defined in the strategic plan. Protect Los Angeles, engage Los Angeles, improve organizational accountability, modernize technology, enrich training, and maximize workforce potential. In addition to aligning with the strategic plan, we also determined that any request must be absolutely essential to our core functions of protecting and serving our communities. The proposed budget recognizes LAPD's role as a leader in law enforcement while regarding its place in a city family where the needs of public safety must be balanced with the other immensely important efforts in city government to create a livable, sustainable, prosperous, and well-run city. We recognize that the proposed budget comes on the heels of the mayor and city council approving additional salary obligations pursuant to various new labor agreements for the city's sworn and civilian workforce. So to President Decker's comment, there was a lot of that which was sort of out of our control, which brought our increased budget. We are requesting an approximately $230 million net increase to our current year budget. Of that amount, about $157 million, or 68%, represents the obligatory increases to salary and overtime costs due to new labor agreements for the city's sworn and civilian workforce. $89 million of the increase, or about 12%, is for reimbursable costs associated with the LA County MTA's contract for policing services on bus and rail lines in the city.
So those will be reimbursed at a later date?
That will be, yes. Okay. And they've been great about reimbursing us. We've got a very good working relationship there. That's a $27 million increase from the current year for the MTA contract, and that's primarily for enhanced deployments requested by the MTA, as well as the K-9 build-out.
But the net is zero?
Correct. It's ultimately, it's an increase, but it's all reimbursable.
We ask for more, but we'll get more back?
Correct. 100% reimbursable, yes. And then the remaining $46 million of the increase, or 20%, includes new personnel, technology, training, and other equipment and expense items. So as I mentioned, all of our requests align with the strategic goals. Protecting Los Angeles. Our personnel resources are obviously our top priority. So we've requested that we be allowed to hire for sworn and civilians to attrition, which would mean our sworn hiring would be 495 recruits over 13 classes. For civilian hiring, we would be hiring to attrition to our most critical public safety and other civilian classifications, and that would be 275 civilians. We have, as the chief has said many times, we have 600 fewer civilian positions than 10 years ago, which is why that continues to be a top priority.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that number? How many?
600 fewer civilian positions than 10 years ago.
Thank you.
Okay. Our next item is the non-reimbursable sworn overtime. And the department committed to go through a thorough analysis of sworn overtime usage and funding last fiscal year, and created a sworn overtime task force, that included members of the mayor's office, the city administrative officer, and the chief legislative analyst's office. The task force's analysis of sworn overtime and the impact of earmarking overtime yielded a current year sworn overtime budget that the department could actually manage. We are again requesting that any earmarks are funded, including those that are not previously funded. So for next year, in terms of items that were not funded, that would be fully funding the human trafficking and prostitution detail and Vision Zero. The other part of the non-reimbursable sworn overtime ask is for the COLAs associated with the MOUs, deployment to Abridge home facilities, and then there's a minimal increase for the Major League Baseball All-Star events in Los Angeles in July of 2020. As Commission President Decker mentioned, community safety partnership is a top priority for the department as well as this commission. We are requesting funding and positions to support and sustain the CSP program. As you know, there are currently 8 sites, 6 at Housing Authority locations that are partially funded by HACLA, and 2 at city parks that are partially funded by Balmer. We are requesting full funding to sustain the Harvard Park location, as the funding from the Balmer Foundation ends in September 2020. So that's about $1.3 million and includes 1 sergeant, 10 police officers, and overtime and program funding. We are also requesting 8 sergeants and 80 police officers without funding to replace all of the positions that have been taken from operations to support the CSP program. Those positions would give the department the flexibility to strategically fill them as part of the department's overall sworn hiring plan. But again, we didn't ask for that funding as we balanced our priorities to try to come forward with something that was a reasonable and strategic budget. In terms of strategic goal, Engage Los Angeles, we have once again requested funding for the multimodal community survey to measure public sentiment, as this remains a priority for the department, and grant funding is not a reliable funding source. Improve organizational accountability. As mentioned, we're committed to reducing use of force incidents. As such, we are requesting funding to research additional non-lethal force options and to purchase and replace our taser inventory due to the upcoming warranty expiration. Modernize technology. I know you've all heard a lot about that here, but we are requesting $17.5 million for our technology support program. With the assistance of city funding supplemented by the capital campaign, the department is rapidly moving from the archaic systems to modern systems. The records management system, lifecycle replacement of computers, mobile radio site upgrades, Phase 2 of the customer relationship management system, and our in-car video and body-worn video programs continue to be top priorities, along with critical positions to implement a full cybersecurity, disaster recovery, and business continuity program. In aligning with the city's sustainability plan, we are requesting car washes with water-saving technology, a sustainability coordinator, and the expanded deployment of electric bicycles, e-bikes, for patrol. Enrich training. We continue to prioritize 2 trainings for funding through the annual budget process, as grants are not a reliable funding source, and that would be our implicit bias training and our conflict resolution training. Strategic Goal 6, maximize workforce potential. The proposed budget includes a $1 million request for targeted sworn recruitment to continue the funding and diversity outreach efforts being made in the current year. We also focused on innovation. Consistent with the mayor's budget policy letter, we continue to identify innovative solutions which will increase the time patrol and investigative sworn personnel are in the field. So in terms of operational efficiency, we've requested 13 positions to open the Foothill Jail, and we've requested to implement Phase 2 of the Drop and Go program at the 3 regional jails to continue to reduce booking times. So that would be,
Did San Pedro open from last year's budget?
it is included in this year's budget, in the current year 1920, and it's scheduled to open in February.
Okay.
In terms of innovation as it relates to civilianization and sworn redeployment, the proposed budget includes 3 requests that will allow for a 1-for-1 redeployment of sworn personnel back into the field. And that includes 8 positions in area stations within operations to perform crime analysis and review body-worn video, 2 positions that would be a new, a new classification of community station officer as part of a pilot program at an area station. Those civilians would work alongside a sworn officer at the front desk and assisting with ancillary duties in the kit room. We've also requested 4 positions in audit division to begin to civilianize 10 positions total over the next 3 fiscal years. The proposed budget makes a significant investment in the health and wellness of our workforce with the following requests: boot sanitizers, hand washing sinks and report writing rooms that don't have them, front desk safety enclosures at 6 stations, security and video surveillance system replacements and improvements at 25 facilities, including the adult and juvenile holding cells that I mentioned, funding for emergency repairs and deferred maintenance. The fleet is also a key safety need in terms of protecting our workforce. And we've requested 316 vehicles, which is consistent with a multi-year plan that was developed by the mayor and the CAO, so that would be general funded vehicles. We're continuing the electric vehicle leases, 235 of those. We've also requested some additional funding for parts as we're keeping vehicles longer, and because of the $5 million that we basically gave back in the current year budget as part of our budget reduction exercise. For the MICLA funding, which is essentially the city's credit card, we've asked for funding for 406 specialized and undercover vehicles, as well as 1 replacement helicopter. The total budget overall, if everything were approved, including MICLA and the alterations and improvements, would be $2.08 billion. We've also included requests for funding for the General Services Department, about $1.2 million, to restore custodial services and building maintenance in department facilities. While we are very cognizant of the needs of the city overall, and like I said, we're trying to temper public safety with the rest of the city's needs, as we already discussed, a lot of these items are kind of out of our control in terms of the salary adjustments. But we did, like I said, we worked really hard to align everything with the strategic goals, with the mayor's goals, and there are a number of items that we obviously did not include here. In addition to your executive summary, following that, you have the list of all of our items in priority order. So not only did we prioritize what made it into the budget, we then, in accordance with the mayor's policy letter, we went ahead and aligned our requests to, we itemized and prioritized our requests that way. So that is it for my official presentation, but we're happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Chief, I should ask if you wanted to make any statement regarding the proposed budget.
Well, I want to thank the staff again, that Ms. Anne-Marie Sauer and her team, as well as Commander McMahon and Commander Vartan. Mr. Vartan didn't make you commander equivalent. But nonetheless, the staff has worked very diligently, and I particularly appreciate the way that Ms. Emery Sauer can demonstrate its adherence to our 6 goals. And we believe that these are measurable goals, and these are things that will make a safer Los Angeles, a more efficient LAPD, and is the correct and appropriate and efficient use of what finite resources. There are many other demands that frequently we'll have conversations here. This morning, for instance, lockers and various other matters that we see the foundation and other providers engage in. This is also recognizing that that we can't do everything. And so I'm particularly hopeful that this is a measured approach that will be viewed. While we are aware that traditionally this is the high water line and it goes down from here, we are trying, and I'm committed to avoiding setting high anchors that are really false ceilings, that really are not meant to be representative of what we need. I believe this is a measured and need-based budget that will improve the safety of Los Angeles, and I look forward to this Commission's vigorous questioning and inquiry of this, and also your support.
Thank you, Chief. Since I had the opportunity to speak with the budget team, I still have questions, of course, but I'd like to defer to my colleagues to kick us off.
I just have one. Last year, the total budget of the city was pretty close to $11 billion. Do you have any idea what the total budget will be this year?
This year for the whole city?
Yes.
In terms of 2021?
Yeah.
No, we don't. I don't know where the revenue and everything is falling. It's still pretty early.
So if it were to stay what it was last year, which was $11 billion, our percentage of that was what?
What percentage is our
of the
budget?
total budget?
Yeah. Of the city's total budget, what was the police?
We be?
So of the general fund budget, this department represents, as does fire, these 2 agencies. The public safety of this city is the largest consumer, if you will, of available resources that are here, and that is consistent with the mayor and other elected officials' desire to keep the city safe and a destination for all.
So it's about 20%. 2 out of 11. Yeah.
Yeah, Patricia's saying
Okay.
yes, 1.7.
It's 17%.
Our budget is $1.7 billion out of the $11 billion.
Okay. Thank you.
How much is that, Steve? 4.7.
Excuse me, sir. Please do not shout out, sir. Mr. Smith, please do not shout out, Mr. Smith. Thank you. Is that it, Mr.
Yeah.
Zuber?
Thank you.
Mr. Bonner, do you want to?
That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll say that some of my questions I think are probably going to, or many of them are going to be probably directed to the chief as well, because they are somewhat policy oriented. For a couple of broad questions, though. First, the binder that we received on Friday and this is speaking exclusively to the increased budget request and not the base budget, right? So this is not background on everything that's in the current, that's in the historical budget. It's really just the new request.
Correct. The proposed budget is basically the change, and what ultimately becomes the adopted budget shows the change from the current year to next year. There are some items, for example, recruit hiring is something we have to ask for each year. So it gets kind of added in each year and then backed out. So while we have recruits, 495 recruits in this year's budget, you'll see that in next year's budget as well, because some items are considered one-time funding that are revisited by the mayor and the council each year.
And I presume all that is a product of the city's budgeting policy and not the department's
Correct,
choice?
yes. How we budget aligns with the city's process.
Okay, and then largely for that reason, in terms of not really having at the fingertips information about what we're currently spending or what's currently in the budget, just tell me, broadly speaking, for example, is there anything in the current or in this request, other than the tasers and so on, is there anything in here relative to new weapons or types of weapons, weapon systems, anything of that nature?
No, the only items are those new to test new non-lethal and then to replace the tasers.
Okay, and then also maybe, Chief, you may know this also, relative to some of the discussion we've been having throughout the year about predictive policing and so on. There's some changes coming in that regard in terms of the guidebook that's under development. Is there anything that, since we've indicated that we're doing things either less or different in that regard? Are there budget reductions or anything of the consequence in that nature that's reflected here, or maybe that exist but are not reflected here?
So the money, or the request that you have before you of the $17.5 million that was identified for technology are supporting the record management system and our existing IT. There is a modernization of the record management system. The vendor is Niche. That which is our core system of how we identify and bring into the organization the investigation of all crimes, as well as the recording and processing of arrestees, as well as property. So there's a number of systems that are legacy systems that the record management system replacement is changing the life cycle out of. But specifically to Predpol, which is the outside organization that we currently have we're using as a pilot, if you will, of location-based strategies. There is nothing in this budget that supports that manner. That last year there was a $50,000, I believe, cost associated with some hardware to support that system and our continued use of it. But to date, we have not made that as a budgetary matter moving forward. That is still something that's under consideration, if you will, as we evaluate the utility of that system. The other matters that are in here is there's often been criticism of other systems, such as the Palantir software system. There is money in this budget that continues that annual relationship with that data aggregator, or that system that allows us, as from an investigative standpoint, to look into data, into information about crime and offenders, and to identify relationships that help us solve crime. So those are blended in here. We'd have to go somewhat of a line by line to give you greater granularity on that.
And on that last point, and that's kind of one of my questions, and again, not seeing the full existing budget, if you will, so it's not clear to me which items are line itemed in the budget and which are not. So the $50,000 you referenced, I don't know, would that have been something that someone would have said, oh yeah, we were spending that, it's a line item, and now there's some reference to it being lined out and that we're no longer making that expenditure, or is it subsumed in a broader category of IT?
So I'm going to refer back to my team on this, because to their point, there's been this budget is supposed to have a baseline that recurs year after year after year, and that's a white book, commonly known as a white book. And then there's a blue book, which is basically the adds and the deletes, and our budget is a combination of both. So you have some items, as Ms. Sauer indicated, that they appear to be new, but in reality they're recurring. Each year we attrit 400 to 500 personnel, and each year we have a new item of hiring for sworn and civilian. People will look at this and, for instance, say you're hiring 275 civilians. In reality, that's going to be an equal to 275 people leaving the organization. So those are detailed within this budget, and you're able to see as a commissioner, and the public can look and see those individual line items. There, to your point, there's another underlying set of ongoing resources, such as maintaining our servers and various other technology and other fuel, vehicle tires, those type things that aren't noted in this budget, because those are recurring year to year. As a budget team, this team is charged with managing, I'll use fuel as an example, a set aside for how much monies are set aside as a city, and then do you actually stay within that budget, or are there discounts and things that occur during the course of the year, so you actually get savings out of those accounts. So that is really a dynamic situation that this team is constantly managing. Printing and binding, the matter of producing reports, can vary from year to year based on information that we're publishing internal to the organization as well as external. So those day-to-day budgetary matters are requirements that we then report to the Board of Police Commissioners, to the city, quarterly. Each quarter we have what's called a financial status report that goes, how are we performing in relationship to our budgeted line items, and what changes have occurred, challenges or opportunities for us to realign monies in an effort to ensure that each dollar is spent with the appropriate restraint and efficiency.
And how would, like, I didn't see anything in here directly, and I'm going to continue to say I didn't see, so if it's in here you can direct me to it, but how would something like CompStat be where would that fall into this? Would it be something that somewhere we would see a line item that shows the costs associated with maintaining and utilizing the CompStat process, or is that subsumed in a larger line item relative to IT or operations or something else?
So CompStat, I think, is a good example to say that it's layered. For instance, we have a command called the CompStat Division, which is made up of a captain and a series of rank and file individuals that make up personnel that make up that command. But CompStat is also a process. It's a command accountability process, and it's interwoven into all of our activities, including this budgetary process, to demonstrate what's working, what's not working, what are strategies to achieve our goals, and what's the feedback loop of adjustments that we make as we continue to go through our refinement of our day-to-day operations. So CompStat per se is much like community policing was last week. It's a philosophy. As much as I can point to a unit that makes up the CompStat division, it really represents activities that occur at each work unit throughout the entire organization. For instance, next Wednesday is the citywide CompStat inspection on traffic. So when you say where's CompStat in the budget, it's a command that has personnel. There's technology and equipment that support its operations and its evolution, but it's also an organizational philosophy.
So let me just tell you why I'm particularly asking about that question is. And I would also say that some of my questions and comments are coming from the perspective, in our new liaison assignments, I'm responsible to talk with you and others about strategic planning. And one of the things that I hope that we will talk about in the ensuing year is the idea of further expanding or evolving CompStat to evolve from simply a system that is primarily focused on crime data and crime statistics to also having more on accountability. So, we have lots of reporting that you're already doing on traffic stops, use of force, all those things that are, at least from what I can tell right now, kind of dispersed throughout different parts of reporting systems and on the website and so on. So and I'm using this as an example to understand if we have this conversation and if I'm successful in prevailing upon you and my colleagues that we ought to consider making some shift in this approach. Question is that a line item in the budget where someone's going to say we can't really do that because we didn't put anything in the budget, or is it the kind of thing that, as you just described, there's so many different elements of it that, there could be changes made short of submitting a specific budget request.
So let me just clarify that CompStat is by no means limited to crime data, instances of crime, instances of arrest. Page 2 of the CompStat profile are internal measures, are internal performance measures relative to complaint management, relative to the use of force, pursuits, various at-risk activities, and year-to-year changes, as well as how they peer or benchmark to others. The use of, for instance, overtime hours, the use of sick time and injured on duties. Those are all markers that are in the CompStat profile at an individual level that builds up through the city. And the reporting of that is meant to help this organization ensure that we're managing efficiently the wellness, for instance. We use sick and IOD time to understand instances in which safety practices at an area may be having a negative impact on the injury rate. We see this today, and it's manifested now, for instance, in the boot cleaning stations that we're asking for. We saw this last year to 2 years, a recurring nature of skin infections and officers encountering serious life-threatening infections from result of exposure to unsanitary conditions, and then bringing those conditions back into a station that lacks the personal or protective hygiene features that you don't have that cross-contamination. So the CompStat profile is an area that you would identify an outlier or a variation, and then it's represented ultimately in the budget by our changing or asking for a substantial investment so that each of our stations have these hygiene facilities in an effort to reduce the instances of these infections and improve the health of officers. So I think the budget here is, for today's purposes, each line should map back to the purpose of the organization and a strategy that we have. And our efforts here today is to show that. But these questions can get involved in the sense that there's various layers of it. For last issue, I'll raise another point, which is each year for now 4 or 5 years, we've had the Pepperdine conflict management class. It's about a $350,000 cost each year to host a series of sessions for first, second, and third line supervisors to improve our ability to reduce workplace conflict. Not just in an effort of reducing civil liability, though we see that as one of the metrics of pursuit of this, but also to improve the harmony and the efficiency of the workplace itself and pulling in the same direction. And then inevitably, when we have groups of people working together, particularly under high stress and high workload issues, they can have conflicts that strategy, that training, that week-long training is meant to improve the resilience. So each year we've asked for it on the budget. This year you see it here again. And we're hopeful and look forward to the opportunity for the city elected leaders to find favor and to prioritize that this year, which would allow us to shift away from our reliance on Police Foundation and other external funders. Same with community survey. Our outreach and engagement with the community, critical that we have customer sentiment. We understand where our communities are and the change of that over time and what may be driving influences, particularly in the communities of color. What is our measure and how are we performing year after year after year? Again, memorialized in this budget as an effort to demonstrate a resolve that we're going to seek the public monies for these priorities rather than ad hocs that are going to come from sources that may not be as reliable or dependable.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And to the kind of the last one reason I'm still thinking and emphasizing here, but think in my mind, is there's a lot in here about technology and technology improvements, some of which is requested in the budget. Some will be addressed with some other outside resources. Yes. And again, I'm signaling that I do think that we should have that continuing conversation that I'm suggesting in terms of how we package not just the crime data, but all of the other things that go into accountability and performance and things of that nature. And I'm trying to make sure that I understand that when I'm seeing all of this, that we're going to invest in the new technologies, that it strikes me as things that we can do within the scope of what's being requested in terms of smart applications and all of those kind of things. But that's part of what I'll be looking for throughout the years to make sure that if we decided that we wanted to package information differently or capture data differently, report it differently, are they things that if they're things that do have an additional cost, we should understand whether they're included in this request. So they strike me as things that probably don't have that additional cost, but that's what I'm trying to understand.
So there's a line item in there for teams. I believe is it $8 million?
This is 1.4.
Okay, 1.4 million. So it's better than 8 million. But so forgive me. But the point of this is that the teams process generates reports based on employee systems, various personnel systems, and those reports can be modified and do evolve over time. How much flexibility we have in maintaining that existing system and its integration to these various feeder systems, and how much we have to create a unique or evolve to the next iteration of that. I believe that there is some flexibility there. When there isn't, we need to identify that and say, this takes 200 hours of programming. We've only contracted for 100 hours of new programming. We have a 100-hour gap. How would we get outside services or a different contract that could allow us to achieve that measurable change?
Yeah, I got it. And that's why partially I think I'm signaling some of what I expect us to be talking more about next year as we're even putting together the following year's budget. So I appreciate that. I had a couple other questions then about, I'm going to page 5 of the summary report. And there's a reference on the bottom of that page. These are not numbered, but I put my own handwritten number, so I hope it is the 5th page. The reference to ensuring accountability. And I noted that there's a discussion really of organizational accountability, and I wanted to also the chief to comment on I know in some conversations there is a focus on the organizational accountability as opposed to officer accountability or individual accountability. Can you just address to some degree why this is laid out? In this case, relative, the emphasis is on the organizational accountability. I was referencing before about capturing data, a different kind of data that may go to in some cases, the behavior of individual officers. But what's the intended meaning or reference to organizational accountability here?
So in these basically 3 paragraphs, the first paragraph is meant to talk about the fact that in our efforts to ensure accountability, we need to ensure transparency. We need to be looking both internally but also sharing externally what we find. And in doing that, we also need to find instances or strategies and techniques, both in tools as well as training and accountability systems to reduce the instances of use of force. And in this budget, we wanted to point out that, for instance, the use of the end-of-life cycle on tasers is an area. An electronic control device is a significant tool for officers to have options other than resorting to the use of deadly force when dealing with a combative individual, a person who poses a risk to the officer, an immediate risk to the officer. And as we approach the end of warranty session on these devices, if the city were not to find support for that, that would be contrary to our efforts to de-escalate and find and give officers tools and options other than having to resort to greater levels of force. So that's the effort here is to warn, is to announce or demonstrate this tool. Its continuation is critical to us in the theme of reducing us having to resort to deadly force because of a lack of other tools that are less lethal. We also are currently, starting this next quarter, will be piloting efforts with what's called a BOLO. It's a tool that allows an officer to stand off, and it shoots a rope that can wrap around individuals' legs and mobilize them. Those type of less lethal tools are tools that afford us the option, again, of officers having options.
Let me ask, because what I'm asking you is relative to the new tools and the gadget and so on. Do you see, because in this paragraph there's a reference to the commitment to reducing use of force incidents and so on along the lines you're describing? And I think kind of what I'm asking is, in your view, do you view uses of force and things as an organizational issue or as an issue relative to the conduct and behavior of particular officers in a fact-based scenario?
It's all of it. It's all of the above. It starts with the individual officer, but it also has to be established and reinforced and continually emphasized at an organizational level, both at a watch level, at a division, at a command, across this entire organization. Also within that paragraph, I just want to transition that you see the issue of us getting into the multimodal community surveys. Again, this year, those funding for that, this is a proposal I believe that will be before this commission here in a few weeks for using this year's efforts to do a community survey. But this is meant to, again, signal the request that this become a standing attribute of our work each year. And so what's blended in there is efforts also, frankly, to civilianize the review, the inspection of various body-worn and digital in-car video snippets as we go about the accountability of instances which don't result in enforcement action. How are we looking at those instances? And this budget provides for, rather than police officers being tasked with that we hire civilian professionals who understand the same set of values of what it means to treat someone with respect and dignity, and to ensure that an encounter follows the policies and expectations of the organization. So that when people say, well, you're asking for people within audit division, or you're asking for people at the division or bureau to handle these, how does that, you're just adding more girth to this organization? No, what we're adding is a capability to improve our transparency and improve our accountability by increasing our awareness of these instances that presently we don't have the staff to work with, or we utilize police officers in lieu of people who are very well capable but are not as costly or as burdensome to the organization and to the city in order to support that function.
And on page 6, there's the reference also, I thought you were going to mention this one because we've talked before about the establishing policies in the current year for expedited complaint and use of force adjudications when there's body-worn or digital in-car video involved.
Yes.
And is that also reference, I think you had mentioned once before that you are starting to use the video technology to also identify issues not only relative to individual incidents or officers, but also, again, to use those to identify other areas of improvement, right? For
Yes.
So if you can comment on that, and again, I'm just underscoring that effort's going to continue, notwithstanding the fate of the budget. In other words, we've talked about, that's just what I'm trying to get at, is how much of these kind of potentially high impact things that we expect to do or think that you should do may not get done or are in some way contingent upon the outcome of the budget.
So, as an organization, we are constantly, as every organization of any size, must adapt to what is available, what are the strategies and circumstances that you can utilize, what your plan is versus what you ultimately result to based on changing circumstances. What you have here before you is a budget that we believe allows us to strengthen our abilities in certain areas of accountability and transparency and overall operational efficiency. If they were not supported, some instances will have material differences. We will not get there because I'll have no other options. Other instances, we'll have to have a plan B. And the expectation of me as chief and my organization is, well, this was not supported. So what are other considerations, other options? And that's where this board will then see adaptations of an organization seeking your approval to use a different alternative. We've seen this, and this is something that's before you frequently, is the foundation. There's many unmet needs in the organization that the plan B has been to rely upon those philanthropic and other donors and givers that are supportive of something that resources that the department can utilize that were not supported by the limited resources of the city. We are a substantial burden on the city. We recognize that, and we believe that this budget is a managed effort to achieve an improvement, that this is a better organization next year than they are this year. By focusing on these strategies that we've laid out, that requires this investment of public monies in concert with, on the technology side, an effort with and generosity by the foundation, the leadership, for them to initiate added resources. I'll give you a scale of magnitude. We have a 5-year plan to modernize our technology systems. It's $171 million, I believe, is what's been identified, of which we believe $65 million the Police Foundation may have the ability to raise in support of us. So there's a lot of numbers here, but I think your questions are I appreciate and enjoy your inquiry and your governance by looking at these areas, and we are an open book to have further conversations about the details.
So let me just ask you your opinion on this. There are some places here where it is noted, particularly relative to grants, and where I think what they're signaling is, in some cases, if you're putting the request in, if it's not approved, we're going to rely on grants. There's some uncertainty around all that. So there are some areas where that disclaimer is. But on this issue of the additional review of Body Worn, for example, which I think you'd agree is presumably the reason you're doing it is because it's potentially impactful effort. And I didn't see anything here that suggested, relative to the technology items or elsewhere, that moving forward with that effort is contingent upon what the fate of the outcome of the budget. So I'm asked, just in your general sense, is that something that you feel that we're going to be able to continue to do this in the ensuing year, notwithstanding the fate of the budget?
Yes, we can, but it will burden line personnel, sworn members of the organization that would be better utilized by their presence in the field. For instance, you were seeing an effort by the organization through the community station officers, a pilot program which identifies 2 individuals that we would hire as a civilian to work front desk and the kit rooms and other positions that are off the line, if you will. That has the potential, if adopted citywide, to add more than 100 officers to the field. So a workforce that has been relatively stable, sworn members of 10,100 this year. We're at 10,040 today. The ability to scale 100 additional officers to field assignments by this creation of this community safety officer offers us real efficiency. The cost on an individual is probably less than 50% of what a sworn officer is doing. So we see that as also consistent with the mayor. This, by the way, is very much in line with the mayor's strategic plan of this being a safer city, a more hospitable city, a more healthy city, and a city that his civilian strategies have been for departments such as ourselves to identify civilian workforce members who can do the essential functions that we have currently sworn members doing, as a means of growing our department's ability of having more officers in the field to have more time to work and build trust with our communities. So we think that they're all interrelated in play to a safer city.
I appreciate that, and I think one thing I'm suggesting again is that to me, I don't. This is kind of my second year in dealing with this. If you remember, we had the meeting last year at USC that was my first, maybe second, third meeting generally. This is the second go around with the budget, and it's not in my opinion. No process is ideal, but this is a particularly challenging one, largely because of just the example I'm giving, where this does, I think, an effective job, at least in their challenge of tying, budget requests back to language in existing documents. But then there's other things like the example that I'm emphasizing, this idea of how we intend to capture and use data that's now available through body-worn and others. And it is more difficult, I think, to think a little bit ahead to understand what that really means in terms of what it would take to do that in a particular way, and then to make sure that we'll have the resources we need to do it in a given year. Strikes me as something that, as we get into it and drill down on a little bit more, we may find that it's something that results in a request for next year or something. But I'm simply making the point that there's some other things that we've talked about here at the dais that may or may not be fully captured in some of what's laid out, here. And that's one example of them. I'll go on. Let me get a couple others through that are probably a little more straightforward questions. Going on page 8, there's a discussion about the fleet and the request to replace the 210 black and whites. And I think the thrust of this is telling us that because we're not really asking for the 250 that's really needed, that the out-of-service rate is projected to be at 12 to 17% as opposed to the 10.5% or something now. Question: is there some sort of acceptable standard or benchmark or something that we should be? How do we know when we're redlining it or when we're in some sort of danger zone? This doesn't really tell me whether I should be concerned about this or not, or at what point should I be concerned about it?
Well, I mean, as we've indicated here, it's typically the 10% is what is the industry standard in terms of working with motor transport. They've said if we get to 18%, that's really the tipping point. So we're kind of going to be right in there in that 12 to 17%. And while we obviously have the need for more, as you've said, because we've worked with the mayor and the CAO through the years on this multi-year plan, we stuck with what we had agreed to, which would bring us to $15 million. This year's budget has $10 million in cash for vehicles. The 2021 budget will have $15 million, with the plan to get us to $20 million in the following year. So although it's higher than it will be, and part of it is because the reduction we have to take this year in terms of working with motor transport, it's really 18% is where we start.
But even the 18%, is that a department determination based on what's needed and appropriate for this city and this department, or is it?
So our experience has been to ask our mechanics that work with our stations to see whether or not we brown out, whether we have vehicles that are ready and serviceable and safe to work in the field. And there is always an out-of-service rate because vehicles need maintenance. There's accidents and collisions that occur that take vehicles off the line. And managing currently, we're about 11 to 12%. I have not seen, in my experience, us get below that number in the last 5 to 7 years. And generally, I've heard we've looked at the brownout rate of 14 to 15%. I'll trust 18%, but what we look to also is we have our utilization schedules that we watch the behavior of our fleet, how many miles, how old they are, what the vehicle repairs are. You see the dynamics of that in play here, where we're increasing our repair and parts account because we're keeping the vehicles longer because we're not getting new cars that cycle them out. Emery, if you have the current thresholds for servicing black and white vehicles and to end of life cycle, is it 105,000 miles over 10 years?
I think it's 110 right now and 10 years.
So that's where this fleet why is that number? That number used to be 85,000, because that's the number of which we have pragmatically the ability to replace a fleet versus the counterbalance of the cost of maintaining that fleet. As vehicles get older, they break down more frequently, they require more service time, which takes service workers to do. And so we're trying to constantly, we'd love to keep a fleet entirely in warranty, for instance. That way we would not have the burden on local mechanics. But that's not realistic given the demands of the city that we have. We're a city that's a mobile city, and we've got to move around our vehicles. So this is a striking balance. Your point's well taken, though. That's a question we've all asked in years past. The budget analysts know where that number is. We're identifying 12 to 17%, I believe, is the range, which is a pretty high variation. But that's also incumbent, again, upon us going back and in CompStat stressing the importance of officers taking care of their equipment and exercising regard for the safe operation of those vehicles, not just for their own safety, but for the longevity of the fleet.
But am I understanding that two things? One, that when you add all that up, that you're saying that you're okay with where you are right now.
It's tight,
as we sit here today. But I'm also understanding this to say that even with since you're requesting 210 and not 250, that we're on a track to some difficulty.
Well, so yes, we're on the vehicle burden on the city has been a challenge each year, which is why a couple years ago the city came up with a 3-year plan that would take this a bite at a time and to basically restore our fleet. If we go back about 10 years during the economic recession and the challenges of this organization laying off people and losing 600 sworn positions, our vehicle fleet also bore the weight of that because these are real dollars that are going out the door to support this vehicle fleet. Our efforts in the last 5 years has been to try to start catching up with that. We've seen some improvement. This year, however, you may recall that this department was asked, as every city department was, to identify potential costs in our existing budget, the one that's already been approved, to offer the city and to try to make an effort to cover a budget deficit that has been the result of recently passed wage agreements with rank and file. And our budget gap was about $45 million. And we've identified a $10 million savings, of which $5 million has been to pull back what was already a tight budget on vehicles, but to pull it back by 50% as an effort to save money for the city, money that's needed. We think that is doable and will still, while our outer service rate will increase, that it'll be able to stay below the circuit breaker, but before browning out. We'll manage that very closely and watch it. The question, is there any margin of safety there, or margin of error? That's where we pay close attention to.
Okay, but that's what I kind of bottom line of what I'm getting to is you started off earlier indicating that you're not favorable to that idea where you really ask for a lot more than you really need and then try to settle for less. But this is a case where you are asking for it strikes me as it's a case where you're asking for less than you really feel that you need. Well, you're asking for what you think you can do, what you can manage with, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Not from what we need. These are the essentials. I have as chief and as this commission, we all have responsibilities to ensure that our budgets are fiscally sound and understand the challenges this city has in meeting all of its responsibilities. And this budget you have before you here, I support it, and I support the work and staff. It supports our strategic plan. It offers some opportunities to further improve this organization, and I recognize that in May that it may not look exactly like this, and as such, we will, of course, go through council hearings and so forth to address potential outcomes adjustments that the council may wish to make or the mayor proposes in his blue book. And that's the job of leading this organization.
Just a couple of others. One, going back to the point about the areas where there may be some vulnerability if the requests are not approved. There's the discussion about the training and the implicit bias, the conflict resolution, and so on. And are those areas also, if the what's requested here is not approved, do we have a plan for going forward nonetheless, in particular with regard to the implicit bias, hiring the expert who's going to lead that effort?
I anticipate that if that funding doesn't come through, we would look to potentially other grants or the foundation to do it, or try to look within the budget. I mean, the implicit bias is $40,000 versus the conflict resolution is much more. So
in that case, for example, do we wait until, and you'll have to remind me when we'll know the final on the budget, but is the idea to wait until we understand what the final outcome is, and then set about looking for pursuing Plan B and Plan C if that's necessary, or is there already some work being done on Plan B and C in the event, so that there's more of a seamless progress, notwithstanding the fate of the budget?
Excuse me. The conflict resolution, we've continued to ask for funding. I think there's a donation that is either recently come or is coming to the commission for the conflict resolution training from the foundation. The implicit bias, I don't believe a request has recently been submitted, but we would sort of kind of have those in our back pocket ready to go. And again, we're always looking for grant opportunities that are available to the department to kind of diversify our funding options.
Your view on, and particularly on the implicit bias effort, is there going to be a snag there based upon the fate of the budget, or is it something that we can look forward to continuing notwithstanding?
No, I rely upon our experience that we have to, this is open field play at times, the way the plan is versus what we have to do and make adjustments. It really does, this is a dynamic situation that we take upon each day. And so, our goal is to live within our means, live within the budget as provided. And when the budget's produced and approved by the council and adopted by the mayor, we will, we'll be aware of that. We watch it all along the way. There's going to be hundreds of hours of work yet in front of this budget, because unquestionably this budget will go to the CAO. And the CAO's office will ask us a series of questions relative to every proposal, every measure in here, to further provide clarity, information, guidance as they assess it on behalf of the mayor. Then, once that's done, it will then go to Budget and Finance, who will then issue a series. There'll be a budget hearing, and they'll issue a series of requests for report from the CLA that will then be caused to respond to in a matter of hours frequently, and then it'll go in front of the Budget and Finance Committee, and then the full council, which I will appear and make a presentation as well and answer questions. That council will then also generate frequently a series of questions that then, and this is in the time frame of May, that then comes back to the council for action. The budget will then be acted on by the council in the second week of June for adoption, so that on July 1st we have a balanced city budget, and each city department has a budget with statements or with provisions for everything that from soup to nuts as far as how we go about our operations. But all through that process, we're making adjustments as to if this, then that. And that's where I'm really impressed by this team and by an organization that has worked through lean and difficult times, as well as more reasonable, if you will, budget years. And I'm confident that this team will work effectively to prioritize those things most important to this commission, to this chief, to our strategic plan. But adjustments are inevitable.
Appreciate that. Just a couple more. There's a tab towards the end of this binder that's labeled performance metrics.
Yes.
And I'm just curious to know, again, like, what can you provide some context really on what that represents? Sure. And part of my point is that, I had referenced earlier that that we put a lot of focus on crime reduction and kind of what some might think of as nuts and bolts law enforcement, and that's what appears to be referenced here, and that's why I want to understand what this really means.
Sure. These are metrics that we've worked with through the years with the mayor's office that they've included in the budget, and so each year we're asked to provide an update in terms of the estimate for the current year and then what that looks like for next year. So as an example, the number of gang-related homicides, let's say the third one down. So you have that data going back to 2014-15. Then you have an actual there, 148 for 2018-19. The adopted budget, that number is what's included in the current year budget, and then we provide an estimate. So our estimate that we worked with our folks on is 169, and then the anticipation for next year is that that would be 170. So each of these are different metrics that, like I said, the department has worked with the mayor's office. They were established a number of years ago that we continue to review and update as we go through the process.
Just my point on this is that I can appreciate this relative to how it's used and for the budget purpose that you're describing, but it doesn't strike me as matching up entirely with what I would think of as our collective accepted metrics by which we gauge the performance of the department. And I don't know if that's really it strikes me as that may not be entirely what it's intended to be. But I'm making that observation again so that even next year, and as we go ahead and put these together, I'd like to see us tighten up a little more on really emphasizing, what the priorities are and what we collectively really, think that we're measuring the department by. And I, just will kind of close with on page 9, what I see as kind of the core issue or conversation that we either are having or should be having is referenced in kind of the middle of page 9, where there's under the critical personnel, where it says, we also know that success cannot just be measured by a reduction in crime, but also by an increase in public trust. And I think you would agree that's really in many ways represents the core issue of a lot of what we've been talking about. And so I just want to make sure that and I'm saying this also as one who's created a number of budgets and so on. A lot of times there's legacy language, you're talking to the same analysts that you talked to last year about same programs. And I just think it's going to be a good time for us to step back and kind of freshen up everything to reflect really, a lot of the good conversations that we're having. And some of it's touched on here, but maybe not laid out in the way that it might be.
Absolutely, Commissioner. I'll go back to 2021 performance metrics. As you look at the issues there, workers' comp claim, internal affairs closed within 5 months, Metropolitan Division arrests. Metropolitan Division arrest was something that came on in 14-15 because of our expansion and shift to that strategy as an effort to improve and reduce gun violence, particularly gun violence. And so that came in metrics on there. I expect it to go down. Because it's the shifting of our numbers. If you look at average processing time for non-medical bookings, that was people saying the system has been gummed up and officers are spending too much time out of the field and in stations waiting to get back out in the field, waiting for their arrestee to be processed. So these do have connections back to our strategic plan, but they are oftentimes driven by the mayor's office as far as their perspective, their viewpoint of where the organization's at and areas that we need to focus on. Some of them are legacy, some of them emerge each year. It's a living document, and we welcome it being viewed as such.
Absolutely, and that's why I acknowledge that this strikes me as you're striking that balance between kind of integrating a lot of our conversation and what's in a lot of current planning documents, but also what's been in discussion with the budget analysts and with the mayor's office and a lot of others. And what I'm referring to really is not a shortcoming on the part of the people who put this together. I think it really behooves us as the commission and those of us who've been talking and thinking about all these issues to make sure that we're really just refreshing the conversation and making sure that we're talking as much or more about tomorrow as about yesterday. So that's really my final question or comment.
So lastly, I think the CSP proposal that's in here speaks to that. This commission has been desirous, as has the city elected officials, that we that become institutionalized as far as a part of our ongoing public supported enterprise. And by the way, the Bomber Group, who funded Harvard Park on a 3-year agreement, suggested that this is not something that goes on into infinity, and requested that the city adopt this, and this is compliant with that.
Thank you, and thank you, Commissioner Bonner. I really appreciate your questions. My questions and forgive me for jumping around because many of the topics were covered, and I'm going to try very hard not to repeat anything, but I want to be sure there's also clarity. And just to maybe begin on the final point on that list of performance metrics, if I'm recalling correctly, and I may not, I think this originated from the effort overall of becoming the effort of the mayor's office to have departments become more efficient and somewhat get back to basics. But I think what your point is well taken, that it needs to be refreshed and reevaluated as we move forward. So that's an excellent point. So again, forgive me for jumping around a little bit, but some of my questions are rather pointed. I'd like to first talk about CSP, the Community Safety Partnerships, which obviously this commission has spoken a lot about in the past, the community has spoken about. And I see the funding, of course, for Harvard Park.
Yes.
And we also had an expansion this past year. And I just want to be sure that with respect to the expansions and all the parks and areas where CSP has expanded to, that we have sufficient funding, of course, provided that council and the mayor agree to fund Harvard Park. Is that correct?
So we do have sufficient funding. The big one will be Harvard Park, because the rest in terms of Hackla and Balmer for South Park, we're good with that one. That would be something we would ask the city for in the following year's budget. But in terms of Hackla paying for the upgrades for the rest and Balmer for South Park.
So Harvard Park obviously is the high priority
Correct.
for this year to ensure that there's funding.
Yes.
And of course, if there's not, that's when we have to resort to the backup plans you referred to earlier about looking for grants and looking for other opportunities. Is that correct as well?
True, in order to sustain that program, yes. But we do have also, just I want to note, included in our proposed budget are a number of letters of support from council members and the mayor as well. So.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. It's good to know that there's support. There was some discussion earlier, I think at various points in time, about equipment and certain equipment being at the end of warranty. But Chief, I'm not sure you gave the explanation on the potential looking into alternatives to traditional firearms. You started talking about a bolo, and I don't know that you actually explained what that is or if it's included in the budget. It could be me that I missed it, but if you could just briefly explain what that is there funding provided for that? I think it would be a testing program.
Yeah, so I'll ask staff. I know that we have our force option simulator replacements for $430,000 in here, and that's these are the each of the stations, as well as some of our specialized areas, have a simulator that shows encounters with individuals that require officers to articulate and demonstrate their knowledge of their training skills and our policy relative to use of force and de-escalation and seeking compliance. A number of those are out of life cycle. I've got Commander Baeza here, or Chief Baeza, if he might step up. And is there an area here that on the BOLO and on the net, did we ask for less lethal tools? Is there monies to set aside here for those added ones, or are these just simply replacements of the existing
Correct.
ammunitions?
Commander, excuse me, Chief. Chief Martin Baeza, Commanding Officer of Personnel and Training Bureau. Thank you. In regards to our request for the less lethal budget items, that's strictly for the replacement of existing equipment and also for the cartridges and the maintenance of it. In regards to the tasers that were referenced, we have approximately 3,200 that will be going out of warranty February of 2020. And we're currently in the process of testing the new technologies from Ion Nexus in order to get those out. The balance of the 7,600 that we have in inventory will then go out of warranty in July of 2021. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to make sure that we had our officers equipped with the most current technologies, and in addition to that, to make sure that they are not out of warranty because any broken pieces will not be replaced, any malfunctions will not be covered, and it also is a substantial liability to the department. In regards to the BOLO wrap, we are very excited to be piloting the BOLO wrap. Like the chief described earlier, Our launch is approximately January 19th, which is our deployment period 1. In order to get it out, we've worked with Bolo to get 200 pieces to be deployed and to be tested. What it is, it's a device that's handheld that fires a Kevlar cord that will wrap around an individual's lower torso in order to assist the officers in taking them into custody with limited mobility. We have been actually in the last year and a half, we had actually been product testing the Bolo wrap, and we are now at a point working with the manufacturer that it meets the needs and standards of what the Los Angeles Police Department is looking for in regards to our non-lethal devices. We are going to be piloting this program for 90 days, and the reason that we had asked for the doubling of the devices is because we wanted to make sure we had enough deployment to do a adequate evaluation on that particular device.
Okay, now back to the budget. Is that a line item in the budget? I'm not.
Yes, so under the priorities, number 3, personnel training and support, the second line there, less lethal devices, $250,000, includes the ongoing,
It's in that. It's within the
It
less
is
lethal.
within that, yes.
Understood. Thank you.
Okay.
I just didn't piece that together, so
Okay.
thank you very much. Again, I'm jumping around, so forgive me. Chief, I think you spoke of, and perhaps Ms. Sauer, you also spoke of health hazards at the different divisions, which we, of course, have read about. And in the budget, there are requests for, we put it broadly under employee health. Are you confident that the requests are sufficient to address the different problems that have arisen, whether it be viruses, infections, et cetera, at the different stations?
Okay. I would say it's a start. I don't think any of what's in here is, again, kind of perfect world scenario, just being mindful of the conditions that we're in. So, for example, the 50 boot sanitizers, we think that would do, would make amazing progress, would certainly minimize what people are encountering, what they're bringing into the stations. But we don't think this is the be-all and end-all of everything. We've worked really closely with facilities maintenance and with general services in terms of cleaning supplies and whatnot that we are deploying throughout the department. Again, the hand washing sinks, all of that's going to help minimize the transmission of bugs.
Is it that you're trying to see if these combination of tools addresses the problem before you invest in more, or is this, do you believe, the solution for those issues that have
We think
arisen?
it's the solution. I mean, the results we have in terms of the data on the boot sanitizers, and I think it's the 80% reduction in kind of, again, germs being spread. But, I mean, it's also, people need to wash their hands and things like that. So, I mean, while we can provide the tools, there's also the, employees and whatnot have to have.
Here's what everybody has to do.
And Ms. Sauer, I believe there's added monies in here for general services maintenance as well.
Correct, because that's been a big part of it as well, just the lack of the custodial services and things. So the maintenance as well as custodial services.
Understood.
That's at the very end of the budget.
A general question regarding body-worn and digital in-car video and the equipment that may be at the end of a life cycle. Again, the replacement needs, as indicated here, is that keeping us up to date, or are we falling behind on that, generally speaking, on the technology?
John McMahon, Commanding Officer, Information Technology. That is keeping us up to date and keeping us up to speed with our current contractual obligations with the vendor.
So we have not fallen behind on that, is that
No.
correct? Okay, thank you. With respect to recruitment, as you know, this commission has continually indicated its concern about ensuring that we're focusing on diversity. And I know last year the department was successful in getting some monies to, I guess the right term is target recruit, or I might not have the terminology correct, but is the proposed budget to continue that in the same amount in the same fashion, or is this to change or upgrade the efforts.
The funding we received in the, I'm sorry, Commissioner. The funding we received in the current year from the city is $750,000. So this ask is for $1 million, but we've also been able to get additional grant funds. So I imagine we would continue to pursue that as well. But this is an increase in terms of the city's contribution.
It's an increase, but is it to continue the same efforts, or is it to alter those efforts to add more components to the recruitment?
I'm going to let Chief Baez address that.
Absolutely. Chief Baez again. Commissioners, it's to continue the efforts, and it's also to enhance our ability to recruit and also to fix the systems that are in place in order to bring down our ultimate objective of having a diversified recruitment and pool of applicants. One of the biggest challenges that we face is the bringing down the hiring process from right now, which is about 200 days to 90 days. That also entails working with the personnel department, which they've been great partners in addressing some of the business end of the hiring process and streamlining the 7-step process and maybe bringing it down to further streamline the system and make it more efficient. So it's a combination of both things that you referred to, Commissioner, in regards to building our existing strategies in marketing, and it's also in addressing bringing down the hiring process to 90 days and to make it more efficient in order to meet our goals, our diversified hiring goals.
This is a area that Commissioner Bonner's earlier questions, what you ask for was what you get. This year we had about $1.35 million, combination of the $750,000 plus the contribution of 2 major donors that supported their department's efforts into marketing. We are still in the process of developing that marketing material. Our request last year was for $1 million of the city budget, of which $750,000 was provided. So we're back to that original request. The reason why that number, we believe that year after year of that type of funding can promote a presence in the media market for the areas in which we wish to focus and deepen, which is women, African Americans, and Asian Pacific Islanders. And so the $1 million, I think, in the absence of any other outside funding, would still be a reduction. But it would be, again, it's a measured mark of what can we realistically ask for. 12 years ago, 2007, that number was $2 million a year. So these are, as an organization our size and energy, as you know, we're in historic lows on unemployment rates. So finding a capable workforce and a willing one is one that we need to get better in our time from applicant to seat, but we also need to target and identify those groups that we want to see enrich diversity, which means a heavy marketing outreach and engagement in those particular settings.
Right, the effort has to be very intentional, so yes. I appreciate that. Thank you, Chief. I'd like to shift a bit to back to grant funding broadly. I noticed, I think in the executive summary, but I read it elsewhere as well in the budget. There's some concern about federal grants that are at risk, and I don't want to get into the litigation. I know that there's ongoing litigation, but I don't have a sense of what is at stake. Like, how much money are we talking about? Which programs are at stake? And I realize there's a lot of unanswered questions, but I just don't have a sense of what the potential problem is.
At this point, the 2 big ones that are at stake are the COPS hiring grant and the Bureau of Justice Assistance grants. Those are the 2 big grant programs that are sort of tied up in the litigation. I don't have a dollar amount with me at the moment. I would be happy to provide that to you. But for example, the COPS hiring has funded 25 officers in the budget. The grant, they have not put out notices for the last 2. We're looking at potentially 3 fiscal years from the federal fiscal year standpoint. So again, for us, 25 officers would be huge. If that's something we continue, there's some discussion that we could apply for up to 50. So again, all of that, but that's on top of the existing workforce.
Right. I recall the COPS grant has always changed or varied a little bit year to year. The BJA grants are more, if I'm remembering correctly, broad-based on specific issues that DOJ is either measuring or interested in. Is that a broad understanding?
Yes.
Okay.
And this commission just approved our applicant for, I think it was 2 or 3 of those BJA grants as applicants. We have not seen the decision as to being awardees or not.
Right, and that might be tied up in that lawsuit. Is that accurate?
No.
That's all part of it.
No,
They did
that's
release those funds, but again, none of that has been announced yet, and so we'll have to see if the whole lawsuit impacts us.
Okay, I don't think it's necessary to come back to the commission unless other people want to hear. I'd be curious broadly what's at stake at some point in time. A few other things, you mentioned earlier civilianization, and in that context, you did bring up the audit division, but I noticed in reading the budget book, there were other civilianization efforts underway. Could someone explain broadly the scope of the efforts to civilianize and, as the chief, I think, articulated earlier, put more officers on the street?
In terms of beyond the 3 that we've included here? I mean, we have
On the audit division.
Beyond the audit division, there's also the crime intelligence analysts and the police performance auditors at area stations to view body-worn video. So there's that one. There's audit division, as we discussed, and then also the community station officer. That would be a new classification. So those are the 3 civilianization requests that would result in a 1-for-1 redeployment of a sworn versus kind of operational efficiencies.
And how many officers collectively might that, if all of that funding is awarded in the budget process, that would result in how many more officers?
14.
14 in total?
The real benefit is that I'm really hopeful for the community station officer concept. It was a concept that was brought out of a command development class that identified that upwards of over 100 positions could be freed up by the establishment of that work class. So this is an experiment with that.
It's an effort to move in that
Yes.
direction. Okay, I understand.
The overall goal, Commissioner, is we've identified over 400 positions that through a structured re-engineering of the organization could free as many as 400 civilians over 400 sworn personnel over time. The largest one being this community safety officer position.
Very good, thank you. Chief, I think this question is for you. I just want to close the loop on an issue that has come up, well, not for months, but a few months ago, you mentioned that there might be an issue with transportation in the sheriff's department. And I think we had a brief conversation about how that might impact the budget. I don't see anything here on that. I'm assuming that means that issue has been resolved and the sheriff will continue to do transportation?
Yes, meeting with Sheriff Villanueva, I'm very pleased that issue has been resolved, and we're entering into a contracts for a 3-year contract for continued services to include Harbor Division.
Okay, very good, thank you. And then I think my final question on what would be page 10 of the executive summary. There's a reference to impact on recent legislation, and there's a summary of a new law about standardized sexual assault evidence kits being standardized and placed in local hospitals. Will that be the responsibility of the Los Angeles Police Department to ensure local area hospitals have those kits?
That is our understanding of the legislation that was signed by the governor, which is why we don't totally have an order of magnitude of what that looks like in terms of deploying them or even what the approved kit would cost. So that's why it's sort of highlighted as a potential concern.
So it's not the responsibility of area hospitals to ensure they have these standardized kits, but the responsibility of every local police department?
That is our understanding, is that the police department would be mandated to supply them, yes.
And if there's overlapping jurisdictions, is that resolved in the legislation?
We haven't really gotten there yet.
Okay.
I'm
it's a little curious to me on how that's going to be implemented. It looks like it's curious to you,
right.
too.
Yes, it is.
All right.
It's an area that we'll explore. The way it's described, it would be based on the agency conducting the investigation, but we'll work with, because of the reimbursement for costs involved with victims assistance and so forth.
I understand that. Thank you. That actually, now I understand the logic behind the legislation. Thank you. I don't think I have any further questions. Does anybody else?
Just one quick one on what you were just asking about the new legislation. The report does indicate that there's some question about whether there will be sufficient funds to comply if the budget's not approved. What does the legislation say relative to a department that may not comply, whether it's for lack of resources or otherwise?
I would definitely have to check back on that. I don't believe it's a state mandate that's funded. I mean, we have some items that the state does require that are funded. I don't believe this is covered by that, but I will certainly go back. I'm happy to get back to you on that.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, I think we'd be interested in hearing more on that, just as you can get information. Thank you very much. Other questions from commissioners? No? Public comment cards, please.
Yes, we have 5. The first 3, Adam Smith, Yvonne Michelle Autry, and Hamid Khan.
Mr. Smith? Thank you, sir.
Good morning again.
Morning.
I don't want to give Mr. Soboroff any more attention than he should get, but as a mayoral candidate and someone that's been up here for 6 years, to not know the difference between the restricted budget and the unrestricted budget, I don't know if you're being disingenuous or you're just obtuse, but either way, like, it's a bad look. Mr. Bonner, as a member of the subcommittee with Commissioner Goldsmith that looks at predictive policing, I'm wondering, you mentioned the USC meeting last year where the audit of Laser came out of, I think, if I remember correctly. Palantir helped with Laser and with chronic offender bulletins. Both of those programs obviously were audited and ultimately were shut down. So I'm wondering what the chief is talking about when mentioning Palantir and mentioning how that program is still used to look at offenders after the supposed dismantlement of those programs. Now, I've only been coming here for 2.5 years, and I'm glad none of you have to know me personally. But one thing you may not know about me is that, like, I have this really long-standing relationship with cynicism, and so let me put that aside for right now. I'm wondering, like, you as the Civilian Oversight Board, do you ever think about, like, what would the conditions be where you don't think the LAPD needs $200 million more dollars, where they don't need a budget increase every year? You brought up the conflict resolution, dispute resolution as being institutionalized, was the words that the chief uses. Money that usually is provided by grants and it gets turned into budget. And I think about the institutionalized violence against black people, and here we are. You guys are about to approve $250,000 for us to actually spend ropes, to buy ropes that they're going to use on the black community. How fucked up is that? You want to talk about institutionalized?
Sir. Ms. Audrey?
I'd like to support what my colleague Adam just said. I'd also, for the record, like to speak against any additional weaponry that's in development, whether it's a bolo wrap, whether it's any taser, because they are disproportionately used to target black people, people of color, and now poor people who are incriminated. And this is very much a criminal injustice system. Criminal injustice system. I'd also like, for the record, to speak on the fact that you're building or maintaining martial law in what is a police state. And I was born in Inglewood, and I don't want to live in that type of society. More money should be allocated towards preventing criminal misbehavior, not towards the industry, which is what you are employed to deal with, and which is what this system capitalizes on. I was the victim of violence, and I was incarcerated for 2 days, right? And the pedophile, misogynist, abuser of animals, sadistic predator was out, and he's still out. This is a criminal industry. It's a criminal injustice system. And I'm not the only one who has been incriminated. When I was in jail, most of the women who were incarcerated for defending themselves against either husbands or boyfriends. Again, that is reversal of culpability, incriminating the victim, incriminating the whistleblower, or incriminating incriminating the one who is the victim of the assault. So this is actually sexual bias as well as incrimination of the victim, whether it's in terms of a scapegoating attempt or sacrifice. So again, I'm speaking against any money used to promote this system in the same way in which it is happening. The
Thank you,
victims need to be protected, and again, we need to stop the bias policing, racial bias policing, and also the incrimination of the poor people, people of color, people that are exposing the fact that this is a business.
Thank you.
Next, we have Michael Williams and Joseph Ocon.
I'm sorry, did you say Mr. Khan had?
Yeah, I don't see him present.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, the next speakers, I'm sorry, I didn't get it.
Michael Williams and Joseph Ocon.
Mr. Williams.
So this budget is being approved on the idea that it can actually stop or help with public safety, or it can reduce crime, which any criminologist worth his salt knows more police on the street, more equipment for the police does not reduce crime. There has been many studies, including here in the United States, in multiple cities just as big as Los Angeles, bigger, that show that putting more police, putting body cameras, installing tasers, does not stop or reduce crime. It doesn't help with accountability for the police. It doesn't even help with police shootings. It does none of those things. And so when you're looking at this budget and you're saying that you're going to give money because you're thinking that it's going to help public safety, that doesn't make any sense. That's contrary to every logical study about policing that has ever come out that is worth anything. Literally. How about we try proven methods before we start doing this experimental stuff that's going to cost people their lives? You know what has, throughout every single country, throughout every single city, has worked to reduce crime, is putting money into public access resources. Those have been proven time and time again to be the #1 reducer of crime in any city, in any country around the world. Stop putting money, stop saying where this money should go into the police, and start thinking about where it's not going in the city of Los Angeles. Housing, food projects, clothing projects, helping houselessness, helping with medical issues. These things are being defunded and continually defunded, especially in communities of colors, especially black communities, because you continue to approve budgets for the police constantly every single year. You're the first line. You're the front line. Please reject this budget.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Acuna?
Just to start, I want to second everything that's already been said up here today. Some of it I was going to talk about, but because it's been covered, I want to focus on the way that the word community is talked about in this budget. The Board of Police Commissioners, per the order of the mayor, is supposed to meet in the public 4 to 6 times a year. And this year, the Board of Police Commissioners has met in this room every meeting. In fact, last week, when there was supposed to be a public hearing about community policing, community activists who showed up at that meeting were forcibly removed. Activist Greg Akili was arrested and sent to jail. And so the message that is sent is that this police commission is maybe only for some members of the public, some members of the community that want the police department to be involved. And actually something I overheard at last week's commission meeting was Chief Moore speaking to somebody to reassure them that, don't worry, these members of the community that are being forced out of this room are actually a very small part of the community. Those were more or less his exact words. And so the implication here is that some members of the community are not that important, not people that should be listened to, and their concerns are not representative. But the truth is, how the fuck would you know whose concerns are representative when you don't actually meet in the community? When you talk about doing community surveys at the hands of the LAPD, this is not actual community engagement. This is community engagement that serves the Los Angeles Police Department. And when you have community members saying, we want public services that are not tethered to the LAPD, if you discount them and say, well, they're a very small part of the community, that's not actually what the community wants, well, that just sends a message that you don't really care about the community.
Thank you, sir.
Madam President, we have one late card.
Please add that to general public comment, please. Okay. And with respect to the request is to approve the department's report and transmit to the mayor and the city administrative officer. Is there a motion to that effect?
So moved.
Is there a second? Second. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? It passes 4-0. Thank you. Next would be the chief's report, but Chief, if you don't mind, thank you very much for all your work. If I could just address a short matter. And in part it's related to last week, but the last public comment that was made. I've stated several times that I'm not sure if people have heard, or perhaps I have not stated it clearly enough, that we will be having community meetings. In fact, they're being planned. They're being planned for different days of the week, different times. They're currently in the planning process. I don't have the dates yet, as commission staff is currently looking at it. There will be a variety of types of meetings where members of the community are invited in, where we go out to the community. The goal is to hear from a number of different voices. I've said that when I was elected president. I said it several times during commission meetings, but it bears repeating. And until we have the dates set up, and I know Mr. Tiefenk and his team are working on that, I suppose I should just continue to repeat that. With that, Chief, we're going to turn to the Chief's report.
Madam President, thank you, and good morning, Commissioners, again. I want to talk about two officer-involved shootings that occurred over this last 2-week period, and then I'll provide some events that I have attended, as well as talk about crime and personnel numbers. Relative to two officer-involved shootings, the first occurred on the 19th of November at approximately 8 o'clock in the morning in the Newton area, in the area of 28th Street and Central Avenue. It involved an individual, male Hispanic, approximately 34 years of age, Mr. Alex Flores. On that date, a uniformed Newton patrol sergeant was flagged down by a community member about a man armed with a knife. The sergeant drove around the area in search of the individual, who was later identified as Mr. Alex Flores, and upon locating him, requested a backup and awaited the response of additional units. Additional units did respond, uniformed officers as well as detective personnel, and followed Mr. Flores in the area of 28th and Central Avenue. There, Mr. Flores, and this is captured on video by one body-worn video camera, as well as a nearby closed-circuit television camera. But in that encounter, Mr. Flores ran towards one of the officers while armed with a knife, and an officer-involved shooting occurred. An additional officer deployed a taser at approximately the same time as the officer-involved shooting. Mr. Flores was struck by the gunfire as well as a taser, and ultimately succumbed to his wounds and died at the scene. There were no officers that were injured in this incident. Force Investigation Division detectives did respond, as did the Office of the Inspector General and the District Attorney's officer-involved shooting rollout team. Pursuant to our policy, the department publishes within 45 days a critical incident video that captures the available video evidence as well as a narrative and context of the event. In this instance, due to the fact that there was public interest, including a demonstration at the Newton area station in the days after this event, as well as some vandalism and concerns relative to the proprietariness of this. And while I've not made any decision as to this use of force investigation as to the officer's actions, I did feel it was in the public's interest to release that critical incident video earlier. So last night that video was released and is available online at the LAPD online website. And it is, I will caution that as an event that happened just a little over a week, well, just a week ago, it is not as complete or perhaps detailed as you'll see in other videos that take a little longer to move out. But I think, again, it was in the community's interest that we provide what we know as of today. Secondly, and this was an event that captured quite a bit of news media last night, was an officer-involved shooting that happened in the Hollywood area. And there, at about 11:30, yesterday morning, at the 6700 block of West Sunset, an individual who we've not yet identified, but is described as a male African-American, approximately 5'8", 180 pounds. In that general area, that individual entered an AutoZone located at the northeast corner of Highland Avenue and Fountain Avenue. There, the individual entered the store and was apparently armed with a machete and stole various items from that store. Two community members who witnessed the incident flagged down Hollywood Division patrol officers and directed them to the suspect who was walking north on McCadden from DeLong Prairie Avenue. The officers followed the individual and observed him walk into a nearby drive-through area of the Chick-fil-A restaurant located at the corner of Sunset Boulevard and McCladden Place. While at the drive-through, the suspect apparently entered the passenger side of a vehicle that had an occupant inside, and the suspect was armed with a machete. This was a portion that was captured by some news footage of a community member nearby filming this encounter. The driver of that vehicle exited, and the suspect, the male, climbed in the driver's seat, and officers at that point attempted to detain him by utilizing less lethal force options, which proved ineffective. The male then drove out of the drive-through at a high rate of speed and collided into two police vehicles that were nearby at the intersection of Sunset and McCladden Place. As the male exited the vehicle armed with a machete, officers utilized additional less lethal force options. Despite these efforts, the individual fled on foot and ran eastbound on Sunset Boulevard. After running a short distance, the male changed directions and began running towards one of the officers while holding a machete in his right hand. An officer-involved shooting occurred at that point. The suspect was struck by gunfire and fell to the ground. He was taken into custody and was later transported by a rescue ambulance to a nearby medical center, where he was pronounced deceased at just after 12 noon. Again, this is an incident that involved Force Investigation Division's response, as well as the Office of Inspector General, the District Attorney's rollout team, and the officers that were involved in this encounter. One officer that did fall to the ground, suffering from the suspect apparently approaching him with a machete in his hand, machete raised over his head. That officer suffered bumps and bruises, but I'm happy to say no other injuries as a result of this event. This investigation is very early in its origin, and again, the public has any information relative to this individual's identity, we ask that you contact the police department, and we will. This will also be an event that will, as the video evidence is collected and other information, will provide a critical incident briefing at a later date. Relative to significant events that have happened this last week, I want to first recognize a tremendous addition to my staff, an individual who has a tremendous background in the Department of Justice and a voice that I look forward to relying upon, and as she learns more about the department and how we go about in our efforts to police and provide for public safety in this city. I want to introduce Ms. Liz Rhodes. She's here in the second aisle here, and welcome her to the Los Angeles Police Department. She was with a reception earlier today where Commissioner President Decker, as well as Commissioner Sobroff, were in attendance. Thank you, as well as Mr. Tiefank and the Office of Inspector General, Mr. Smith. But what her job will be is, as the Director of the Office of Constitutional Policing and Policy, is really the department's risk manager, the lead and liaison for understanding personnel management, our training, the various activities that we engage in, and how to manage those risks through effective policies and initiatives. Additionally, she is a chief advocate for understanding constitutional law and its interplay with as we go about challenges here in policing the city. I look forward to her being onboarding here. She's made already a tremendous start in the weeks leading up to her appointment. Has been meeting with a number of staff and senior command across the organization, breathing in this organization and what our initiatives and efforts are. This past week, I attended the Interagency Council on Child Abuse and Neglect, their annual conference. It's called the Nexus Conference, where I sit as a member of the ICANN board and gave opening remarks regarding the Dayline Conference. The conference centered on various topics of prevention, of child safety and protection, child welfare and well-being, as well as the multi-agency collaboration. Particularly pleased that it also gave me a venue to continue to petition the Department of Children and Family Services in LA County for added resources to partner with us in a multidisciplinary team setting where at individual stations we'll have Department of Children and Family Services representatives as well as police detectives and investigators for the serious issue of suspected child abuse in those investigations. We have petitioned and are proposing 2 sites currently, both in the Mission area, and I believe the other one is 77th. But this was a tremendous venue for me to say thank you to Department of Children and Family Services, tremendous professionals charged with critical work of protecting our youth, and also welcoming a greater involvement of our 2 agencies together in that collective goal of keeping our young people safe. Additionally, this last week, our employee organization forum and then later a mixer allowed us to sit and talk with a number of our community, our employee organizations on our collective work of improving the diversity and the readiness of this organization for advancement and for added layers of added roles of responsibilities. I was happy to see both meetings were well attended with a lot of enthusiasm and a real ownership by these organizations that they are a partner with this department in the development of our personnel and really opening lines of communication and ensuring that our mentoring and development of our people is a critical area that we're all invested in. Lastly, I want to thank Commissioner President Decker for attending our graduation ceremony on Friday. I believe that class, 40 young men and women, 2 of which, one was for World Airports Police and the other for the harbor, but they represented, I believe, the best of our future. Were well represented by both in diversity, both in gender as well as ethnicity. That was 35% of that class were made up of women. Clearly, as an organization, our development, both in this budget you just went through and moving forward, is both to invest in resources, personnel, as well as monetary, as well as policies and procedures of how do we deepen the representation of women on this organization. Our goal is for us to have half of our academy classes made up of qualified and capable women that can join our ranks, and our efforts to bolster and build beyond the ceiling, which has been too long below 20% of our workforce. While we're a leader in major metropolitan law enforcement for the representation of women in what has historically been a male-dominated profession, I believe that we have much more progress that we can make in the months and years ahead. So thank you for being there and your leadership. It helps to speak and reinforce the criticality of that goal. Speaking of crime, our crime reduction efforts have working in a collaborative manner with all the partnerships in Los Angeles and with our communities has continued to see a reduction in both property and violent crime. The number of fewer crimes in these categories continue to increase. So we have today a 3.7% reduction in violent crime, and that is 979 fewer violent crimes this year versus last. And our property crimes, we have 6,843 fewer violent property crimes this year than last. That's a 7.6% reduction. For an overall Part 1 crime reduction of 6.7%, that's 7,822 fewer victims of crime in the city of Los Angeles this past year to date. In regards to our gang crime, we're now seeing an overall reduction of 2.7%. That's 98 fewer gang-related crime than we've had a year ago. That's an 8% reduction over a 2-year period. As I do each week, I will discuss our in-custody deaths and officer-involved shooting numbers. We remain at 4 in-custody deaths this year. That number was 7 last year. That's a 43% reduction, and under our 4-year average as well. As to officer-involved shootings, our numbers now total 24 officer-involved shootings this year to date. That number last year was 28, which is a 14% reduction. and that average over a 4-year average is 36, which is just under a 34% reduction. Number of fatalities is, thank you, Mr. Smith. Number of fatalities is 13 year to date. That number was 11 last year, which is an increase of 18%, and our 4-year average is 15. In regards to our traffic collision, overall our traffic collisions are down just under 1%. I'm sorry, just over 1%, with 49,722 reported traffic collisions. The areas in which we continue to be challenged is the seriousness of our accidents, because our DUI-related collisions, our hit-and-run-related collisions, our motor vehicle versus peds and bicyclists, overall collisions in each of those categories remain down, a reduction from 1 year over the next. But the areas in which we see pressure in each of those categories is the seriousness of those offenses. So our strategies in this area will continue to be focusing on the high injury victim networks as to where the high injury collisions are occurring, rather than just the clusters of where most of the collisions are occurring. Next Wednesday, Commissioner Bonner, I would welcome you to attend on the, we'll be having, as I referenced earlier, the citywide CompStat inspection for traffic. And I think it's an area that you'll see emphasis on this, but also this issue of page 2. What are the other performance measures other than just certainly just the activities of whether traffic collisions are up or down. Lastly, I'll move over to our personnel statistics. We have 10,040 sworn personnel within the organization, 2,952 civilians. We have 393 reserve officers. Those are not classified in our full-time employees, and 1,724 cadets. And our next cadet graduation will be in January. I believe it's the 12th, but I'll get the commissioners that date should you find the opportunity to attend. We would welcome your participation. And that concludes my remarks, and happy to take any questions or hear your concerns.
Thank you. Thank you, Chief. Commissioner, questions? Mr. Savard?
Chief, do you break out homeless on crime, homeless as the victim, homeless as the perpetrator, homeless on homeless versus?
Yeah, so on our crime statistics, that is an area that we pay close attention to. Homeless and related crime. Now I will caveat this that of the thousands of crimes that occur, one of the attributes is trying to identify whether the individual is experiencing homelessness, which is, I believe, we are improving our ability. We're more aware of whether the person is living perhaps in a vehicle or unsheltered in a public setting. But in capturing that, that is better today than it was 5 years ago. So there's a certain increase that I'm going to talk about that I think is more awareness than necessarily an increase in crime. However, I do also believe that year over year, with the increasing size of the homeless, with the population of persons experiencing homelessness, that we are seeing an increasing level of violence, particularly violence in some of those communities. Not all of them, not universal, but disproportionate to the general population. It is an at-risk group. It is a group that struggles in its existence, and as such also subject to being preyed upon by others, as well as having a community that within that group are people preying upon others. So to the most recent statistics, though, for Part 1 crime, year to date of victims experiencing homelessness, we have a 28% increase. That's an increase of 737 Part 1 crimes compared to the year before.
Chief, those numbers are also in the total numbers too. They're
yes.
Inclusive.
Yes. And then if I just finish this one last point, sir,
yeah.
And that is suspects, an individual who's involved in, who we identified through witness testimony or accounts, victim accounts, as to a person who's potentially homeless. Now, determining that is not always an easy task, but that number has also increased with an increase of Part 1 crimes of 1,037, which is just over a 23% increase year after year. These are numbers that I believe as we move forward in the next year, we're going to be bringing greater level of acuity, because while I'm seeing an increase in these numbers, what I'm not clear about is how well we're clearing or identifying those individuals involved in those crimes and bringing them before the justice system. I think that and what I mean by that is we look at the number of arrests of individuals who are experiencing homelessness, and those numbers are down. For Part 1 crimes, those numbers are a difference of 1,208 fewer Part 1 crime arrests this year versus last. Very preliminarily, because this is an area we're still learning how to capture the data. But I want to make sure that as our strategies go to see an overall decrease in crime, both property and violent crime in the city of Los Angeles, this area of seeing an increase of persons experiencing homelessness as being reported attributes of either a victim or suspect, how are we working on that to ensure that that individuals committing those type of crimes, Part 1 crimes can be larceny, can be low-level theft, but they can also be very serious, that we're holding accountable, that we're identifying and bringing to the justice system those individuals. So it's an area that we'll be working with operations as we move forward. It's a topic for CompStat. It's an area that I think deserves more work and explanation.
One more on that. Homeless crime?
Yes.
Is that a number that we keep also?
That's one that, so right now I don't have that answer for you as to understand the interplay. I believe most of these crimes anecdotally is within the community, the homeless community upon the homeless community.
Yeah,
however, I don't have that level of detail. That's one of the areas that we'll be exploring. This is, in Canada, this is I think more aptly addressed at an area level, because you lose that granularity when you do it at 50,000 feet of the department. 21 areas, though, this is an area that interplay is much more, you can tease that out much more easily through CompStat, crime control, those type of questions of our command staff and detectives.
Chief, do we process 911 calls and connect them to these crimes so we know if our people who are experiencing homelessness calling 911 to report on crimes within their community?
Yes, so part of, we'll do, with the new risk management, with record management system, it'll be much better, much improved. It'll be much improved because it's called an incident-based reporting standard. Currently, the 911 system is not tied directly into the incident-based reporting standards of what's currently our current record management system called CCAT. It's a manual process. The new system, record management system, is National Incident-Based Reporting Standards, NIBRS, and does do the cradle, the 911 call, through the crime, through the event, all the way through the criminal justice system. So that'll give us a better understanding of the source of those calls.
Okay, and sorry, just one last, I promise. We saw yesterday on the news of a case of a man who called from his cell phone and was asked to give the address while he was having a stroke. And they say that there is technology now that even on mobile phones that will help with the 911 call. Since people experiencing homeless are experiencing homeless, will our new 911 systems, will they be upgraded to include these features to where it'll be helpful to the department? Or do they require a description from the caller?
So let me, I'm not the expert on our new Premier CAD system. I believe currently that the caller ID is what we're limited to, but I will ask for information and have the commanding officer reach out to you.
Thank you, sir.
And I'll ask him to let me know as well.
Thank you. Other questions from commissioners? Anything? Do we have public comment cards?
Yes, we do. The first three, Jeffrey Delshad, Tabitha Jolivet, and Yvonne Michelle Autry.
You seem like you're doing a pretty good job, Chief. Better than your predecessor, in my opinion, by a little bit. I had some thoughts while I was listening to your back and forths. I actually went to a security guard training at one point to get a guard card. We get, FBI fingerprinted and everything, like the whole official thing. And the guy who owned the business was ex-LAPD. And regarding your chief's report and whatever, He was saying like generally like the patrol division is like the worst place to be. So apropos of that, I had several thoughts, but I was just thinking that as the chief, you know, you kind of have like a cultural effect on the soul of the organization. And I think that I come back to this concept that if the way that the department treats its own people and the way that people treat each other is reflected in the way they treat the public and the community. So I feel like there is an issue there in the way that the department treats its own people, and if you are able to leave your mark on that in a positive way, that would probably be felt by the community in a good way. The other thing was that also when I was at the security guard training, the first thing he said basically was the LAPD is a gang. So that's a public perception that exists that maybe also could be improved by behavior and perception and everything.
Thank you, sir. The next three speakers are
Tabitha Jolivet, Yvonne Michelle Autry, Audrey George.
Thank you.
I'm struck by how Chief Moore earlier in this, what is now 3-hour meeting, said that he was enjoying these questions because I don't enjoy being here at all. For those of us who are here to bear witness to the people whose lives have been stolen through police violence, it's sickening to be in a meeting where people are simply thrown away and disposed of with all of the infinite variety that you engage in dehumanizing communities. And so it's actually sickening to be here, and it's re-traumatizing, especially for victims' families. And that's who we stand in solidarity with when we come to these meetings. So when you ask, for example, Steve Soboroff questions about people who experience homelessness or houselessness, not homeless, but houselessness or homelessness, we can't help but wonder if this is just another attempt to engage in more predictive policing that targets Black and brown poor people. When you, for example, criminalize and arrest protesters, in particular organizers like Baba Keeley from Black Lives Matter, who come to these very inconvenient meetings to speak for just 2 minutes. That's all we get. We listen to you for 3 hours. We get 2 minutes to try to provide some level of responsiveness to the concerns that we have about not wanting you to be in Black and brown communities. It's no wonder that the public has very little trust. And I can tell you with assurance that the Black community has no trust. And so when you talk about investing in this budget and amassing more resources to engage in the strategic and targeted violence against Black and brown communities, know that we will be here no matter what, even if it makes us sick to tell you that we don't want you in our communities. Chief Moore, you and your officers need to stay away from our families and stay away from our children, and don't do anything on our behalf because we don't want you to.
Thank you, ma'am. Ms. Audrey?
I'd like to support what my colleague just said. And also, I'd like to bring to the attention to everyone present that prior to my arrest, again, a man had been sexually harassing me for over 2 years, masturbating, urinating on my door, following me to LA Can, following me to various other places where I volunteer and work. I'd called the PD over a period of 2 years about 15 to 20 times. I've called on Department of Children and Family Services, Animal Protective Services, Housing Authority, Section 8. I had documented in writing the fact that this man has not only violated the Violence Against Women's Act, because I know I'm protected in the building in which I live, I had well documented because I know either this man was either a dirty cop, COINTEL, counterintelligence, or as a targeted individual, someone who was commissioned to attack me, engage me into an altercation so that I would become a homeless woman, evicted, which is never going to happen. In Jesus' name, it's never going to happen. But I knew this was going to happen. And in spite of the fact that I had informed LAPD, this man was not only not arrested, I was arrested on a felony charge of assault with a chemical. I have a right to defend myself. As a person who is an advocate in this community, it does not make me a terrorist. I have every right as a female to use pepper spray or anything at my disposal to defend myself and anyone else that I feel in my community that is adjacent to me, in my presence, is in danger. And I wanted to bring that to your attention, that I am being incriminated, much like many of your other victims who are sacrificed because LAPD is a satanic organization, and you sacrifice your innocent blood. That is what this is, cover-ups, and you incriminate those saying that they present weapons when usually they are not.
Thank you, ma'am.
Right.
Thank you, ma'am.
So I'm not going to be murdered by any of your bad police officers claiming that I have pepper spray and I'm armed with a chemical
Ms.
deadly
Audrey.
weapon. This
Ms.
is on the
Audrey.
record and your conscience. It's not going to happen here.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, please have a seat. Thank you, ma'am. Ms. George?
After Audrey George, we have the final two speakers, Michael Williams and Adam Smith.
So I think the chief's report should include some things that aren't usually in it. I'd like to see a report specifically every week about officer-involved shootings that take place in hotspots, anchor points, things that are determined by predictive policing. I would like to see the chief report on how many drone deployments there were. We shouldn't have to wait for an audit on that. We should just know from week to week, whenever that, even when the LAPD requests permission to do it, even if it's not actually deployed. I would like to see in those reports information about the status of the LAPD recruiting volunteers to work in neighborhoods. I'd like to see information about whether those volunteers are involved in any use of force. I know they probably aren't going to be armed, but I'd like to know whether the police commission will have any authority over people that are volunteering in that capacity. I wanted to talk about, and it's just, I wanted to know how normal it is for a fatal use of force, officer-involved shooting, to take place while one officer or more are tasing somebody, and another is shooting at them. It just seems so odd that those are happening, you said, simultaneously. I wanted to talk about this new Bolo wrap, which reportedly the LAPD is excited about. I'm guessing that we're going to hear a lot more about it being used because LAPD never has toys that they don't want to use. I want to talk about that community forum and the fact that a community forum is not something that you hold in secret.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Williams and then Mr. Smith.
This is not what I wanted to spend my comment on, but I mean, literally, you guys approve the budget, and then he gives two officer-involved shootings that prove why giving more money to just tech and gear and more money to police does not solve the issue, right? You said in both cases, tasers were fired, then guns were used, right? So you keep experimenting with these tasers, you keep experimenting with these things, and people are continuing to die. Because you keep experimenting. You know what would have stopped that man from robbing that store with a machete? If he had public access to resources so he didn't need to steal those things from that store. That's just simple deduction. Simple. And you guys still just approved. I don't know what to say. My comments are to Chief Moore. Now, I haven't been to this meeting in months. And as far as I can know, I even looked it up before I came up here because I wasn't sure, because I wanted to give you the benefit of the doubt. Your predecessor, the reason why he was removed from office was because we demanded him being fired because he did not move or have action towards Ezell Ford, who this commission, some of the folks who were on that commission, found out of policy. You have 2 cases that this commission has found out of policy. And as far as I know, and I could be wrong, you can correct me, you have not made a public statement about any firing of either of the officers out of those 2 incidences. So unlike your predecessor who had 1 issue, you have 2. So you're on the clock, Chief Moore. We're waiting for that response, that public announcement about the firing of those 2 officers.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, the chief did make previous statements, and I'd asked Mr. Teefank to provide that information to Mr. Williams offline. Mr. Smith?
Did you want to talk? Okay. I'm glad Mr. Soboroff brought up people experiencing homeless or houselessness, as we call it, because I think it does speak to what happens daily from the LAPD. And going back to the budget piece and how that ties in is that these things that are institutionalized into the budget, the more resources for mental health training and mental health intervention and what it looks like for LAPD to be the tip of the spear when encountering folks experiencing homelessness or houselessness across the city. That is a huge problem. And you know, we see weekly these grants, the Police Foundation or whoever else funding these things, and then they get rolled into the budget like we're seeing today. And I think it's really, I mean, Michael mentioned deduction, and, you know, this money's coming from somewhere, meaning it's not going somewhere else. That's obviously everyone understands that. But when we are talking about LAPD being the responding agency to folks experiencing mental health and drug addiction, it's a problem. I got off the bus Saturday night in West LA at Bundy and Wilshire, near where I live, and there was a black man that had been sleeping on the bus stop for a few weeks, and I never got a chance to go and talk to him, and I saw the response that the outreach that he got. The coroner was there, and there were 4 LAPD cops taping it off and covering him with a tent. That's the homeless outreach, and that's what as we continue to fund the LAPD to be the first responders to
Mr. Smith,
people struggling, that's what it's going to be.
Thank you, sir. Are there more public comment cards on the chief's report?
No.
But then we'll move to general public comment. How many cards are there?
We have 4. Jeffrey Dolshad, Yvonne Michelle Autry, Audrey George, and Michael Williams.
Sir.
All right, good afternoon. Quite a long meeting. Public comment, I guess this is like open season. Misogyny. I'll continue on the last thing about the department and all that. So I've read a lot about politics and whatever, and sometimes I talk to female officers that I've met, like in Venice or in non-tense situations. Sometimes I definitely do feel like it's a boys' club, and that you have an opportunity also as being who you are to be on the avant-garde of American society as far as including women and treating women in a appropriate manner. I remember prior to going to like political events in the like Occupy Los Angeles, Occupy Wall Street era, I didn't really have that much of an sense of like women's issues in high school, growing up kind of like in West LA and stuff. But getting older and seeing getting to know people and getting more political experience, I definitely do feel like there is a lot of substance to the term, which is sometimes thrown around in left-wing circles, let's say, called like rape culture, meaning that the concept of rape or inequality between the sexes is kind of normalized sometimes, or can be treated as in a very normal way, glossed over by different people, institutions, people in power, and stuff like that. Again, in the position you're in, I think you have an opportunity to not accelerate rape culture or not be a part of it to the extent that you're willing or able. That would be a good thing.
You start, Ms. Audrey? Sorry.
Well, I thank you so much. Hearing from a man, that support for women, especially petite women like myself, and women that are victims of gang stalkers, especially as a targeted individual. I have to, for the record, bring to the attention of the commission that the gang stalking has actually gotten worse. I walk and I run quite often in the morning, and the gang stalking near 5th and Spring to the north, 4th, 6th is just horrible. It is just horrible. So, and I like to think that there are some good police officers. After my most recent experience of 2 female Latinas and 1 male Latino who arrested me again, and I'm going to keep repeating this because this is a horrible injustice, that a victim of a domestic violence issue would be incarcerated for 2 days, and the misogynistic pedophile, was not arrested. And he terrorist threatened me. He threatened to throw me out of the window in front of the security guard and one of my neighbors, and he still was not arrested. And the witness did describe this terrorist threat to the police officers who did respond. So again, for other women who have been victims of the gang stalkers, we have a right per California law to defend ourselves. Pepper spray, whatever that we have. I did research that we're not to be incriminated in reversal of culpability. We are not to be incriminated. And for the record, the Mexican mafia, Mala Salvatrucha, that work in my building, I know that they feel that they say that they're commissioned and that they get rewarded for breaking down black women. Whether it's the Israeli Jewish owner of my building that gives them that whether they are an accoutrement of this maintenance of the status quo. I have to bring that to the attention because, again, they are not reprimanded. I've called the police. I've called ICE. So, again, this is all, I believe, branches of...
Ms. Audrey, there are other speakers, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Ms. George and then Mr. Williams.
Black women, breaking down black women.
Thank you, ma'am.
Targeting black people, murdering black
Ms. Audrey, please have a seat, ma'am, so Ms. George can speak. Thank you, ma'am. Ms. George.
I want to tell you my definition of progress. My definition of progress is where the LAPD stops getting more and more funding every year, where we defund LAPD, reducing their role as gatekeeper, controlling funds that should go directly to service providers instead of to the LAPD. The fact that the budget, that they're asking for more money again, that the budget keeps increasing, that we don't count as part of that budget the fact that millions of dollars every year are paid for civic awards to people who are harmed by the LAPD, and that does not come out of their budget, it comes out of the city's budget. These are things that the police commission should be thinking about and addressing. I wanted to talk about that false community. I'm so glad to hear Eileen Decker refer to many more community forums that are coming up. I hope that you actually tell people about them in advance so that people will know. I hope that you will seek presenters again who are knowledgeable and not incentivized in some way like the justice security strategies, security people. I want you to continue inviting Stop LAPD Spying Coalition and LA Can, people that are knowledgeable and have the facts and can educate you and the community. And I want you to respect the community that we are. We are community, and we deserve your respect and your ear. So I'm hoping that, because that was a sham that was a sham last week. People just didn't even know you were having that forum in advance.
Thank you, ma'am. And I do hope those organizations who were invited last week will speak next time. We welcome that. Mr. Williams, sir.
The last time I was here, this council did something that I've never seen personally in almost 3 years that I've been here. And then I was away for a while, and I heard it happen again. The decision to actually go against the chief, to go against the LAPD, to go against everyone else, and find for black folks that have been murdered by the police. I haven't ever came here, and I don't know this to be a fact. If I giving the right credit to the right people, maybe Sandra Figueroa voted, in favor. Maybe Silveroff sent a vote our way. But I think that for me, I've seen a difference in the commission, even just coming here. And I think even though there's a lot that still needs to be done by this commission to really become a community oversight commission of the police, I think there needs to be more scrutiny. I think there needs to be more dividedness. I don't think Chief Moore should have a seat on this commission. He should be sitting in the audience just like us. I think that would put a more emphasis that this is about community, not about police. But I think Dale Bonner and Eileen Decker, the change since you've been on the council, since you've been president, is felt. And I think that it is good if you continue to do those things and push forward more. We need more of the scrutiny on this police department. We need more scrutiny on the chief. And I appreciate the votes.
Sir, my understanding is that concludes public comment cards. Are there cards on the closed session items?
Madam President, we just received one additional card on public comment.
There'll be no late cards accepted today. Are there cards on closed session items?
No, there are none.
Thank you very much. That's pursuant to the rules. As you know, Mr. Smith listed on page 1.
The Board of Police Commissioners will now recess into closed session.
Thank you.
To discuss item number 4A1 and 4A2 in accordance with Government Code 54957.
We'll go into closed session now. Thank you very much.
The Board of Police Commissioners has concluded its work in closed session. We are back in open session. In closed session, item number 4A1 was discussed and the chief's recommendations were unanimously adopted. In closed session, item number 4A2 was discussed and the chief's recommendations were unanimously adopted. Is there a motion to adjourn? Meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Gotta go get blood drawn.
No.
Good morning, everyone.